before the pyramids, before writing, before the first city rose from the mud, something happened. Nearly every ancient culture, separated by oceans and mountains and centuries, remembers the same catastrophe, a flood that erased the world. Mesopotamian tablets, Chinese chronicles, Andean legends, Aboriginal songlines all echo the same warning. Coincidence or memory? Geologists point to melting ice sheets and drowned coastlines. Storytellers point to something older, stranger. Tonight, we cross 3 hours of forgotten evidence, sunken landmarks, and questions no one has fully answered. So, sit back, relax, let's dive into the world before the flood. 4 rivers. That is where the story begins, not with a garden, but with water. An ancient text describes a single river flowing out of a paradise, splitting into 4, the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. 2 of those rivers still run today, cutting through the plains of modern Iraq. The other 2 have vanished. Or perhaps they were never rivers of stone and current at all, but rivers of memory, distorted by centuries of retelling. For generations, scholars have treated this description as a kind of map, a map to somewhere. But where? The most widely accepted theory places Eden somewhere in Mesopotamia, the fertile crescent cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates. It makes sense. This is where cities first rose, Uruk, Eridu, where writing was born, where agriculture first tamed wild grass into wheat. If any patch of earth deserved to be remembered as a paradise, this was it. Lush, well-watered, generous. The birthplace of civilization itself. But not everyone agrees the garden was here. Some archaeologists and geologists have pointed instead to the Persian Gulf. Not the shoreline as it exists today, but the shoreline as it existed 12,000 years ago, before rising seas swallowed it whole. Satellite imagery and core samples suggest a vast river system once ran through what is now open water, fed by ancient channels that may correspond to the Pishon and Gihon. If this theory holds, then Eden is not lost in myth. It is simply underwater, submerged beneath the Gulf, waiting for a diver, a sonar sweep, a stroke of luck. Others look north to the mountains of eastern Turkey, near the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates themselves. It is a region already thick with ancient mystery, home to Göbekli Tepe, a temple complex older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than agriculture itself. Its carved pillars, some over 11,000 years old, predate the world's oldest known cities by millennia. If humanity's oldest sacred site sits here, is it so strange to imagine humanity's oldest story sitting here too? And then there are the theories that drift further from the mainstream. Some point to Africa, tracing the genetic root of humanity back to a single population, and asking whether Eden was never a place of rivers at all, but a folk memory of humanity's actual birthplace, reshaped over thousands of years of migration and retelling. Others suggest the description was never meant to be geographic, that the garden existed in a symbolic space, a threshold between the human and the divine, never intended to be found on any map. What makes this mystery different from so many others is that it resists resolution not because evidence is absent, but because there is almost too much of it. Rivers that are real, cities that are real, a temple that is real, a flooded coastline that is real. Each piece fits somewhere. None of them fit everywhere. So the question lingers, unresolved after thousands of years. Was Eden a single place, now lost to water or dust? Was it a memory of the first fertile lands, mythologized by the people who lived there? Or was it something else entirely? An idea given the shape of a garden, meant to be sought rather than found. Perhaps the 4 rivers were never meant to lead us to a location at all. Perhaps they were meant to lead us to a question, one we are still asking today. If Eden was a question written in rivers, then the next chapter of this story is written in bone. Carved into a fragment of ancient cuneiform, in a museum drawer far from public view, is a list not of kings or crops, but of giants. Beings said to have walked the earth before the flood came and erased almost everything. This is where the story of the Nephilim begins. The word itself appears only a handful of times in ancient scripture, tucked into a strange and unsettling passage. It describes a time when the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives, and from these unions came offspring, the Nephilim, described only as the mighty men of old, men of renown. No detailed genealogy, no clear explanation of what these sons of God actually were. Just a handful of sentences dropped into the text like a door left ajar, and then the flood comes and the door closes. Why is the passage so brief? Why does a text otherwise meticulous about lineage and detail suddenly grow vague at the exact moment it introduces beings powerful enough to be remembered for their size and renown? Some scholars argue this is simply the nature of oral tradition, a fragment of older Near Eastern myth, absorbed and compressed into a few verses because the fuller story was already assumed to be known by its original audience. If that's true, then what we have is not the whole myth, but its shadow. The rest, whatever it was, has been lost. This is where mainstream scholarship tends to stop, treating the Nephilim as a literary echo of older Mesopotamian traditions, particularly stories of Apkallu, semi-divine sages said to have brought knowledge to humanity before a great deluge, and of demigod kings like Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, whose extraordinary strength set him apart from ordinary men. In this reading, the Nephilim are less a historical population and more a motif, a way ancient cultures explained why the world before the flood seemed larger than life, populated by heroes whose scale had no equal after the waters receded. But the texts that expand on this story, and there are several, written in the centuries after the original passage, though excluded from the traditional canon, go much further. One in particular, a lengthy composition attributed to a patriarch several generations removed from the flood, describes the sons of God not as vague spiritual beings, but as a specific class of angelic entities, watchers, who came down to a mountain, bound themselves by oath, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, weapon-making, cosmetics, astrology, the reading of omens. Their offspring, the text claims, grew monstrous in both size and appetite, consuming everything humanity produced and eventually turning on humanity itself. It is a strikingly detailed account, specific angelic names, specific mountains, specific technologies, for a tradition often dismissed as peripheral. Why would a marginal text preserve so much detail about something the central text barely mentions? Archaeology offers no confirmed giant skeletons, despite centuries of folklore claiming otherwise. Photographs said to depict enormous excavated bones have, when traced to their source, consistently turned out to be forgeries, misidentified whale or mammoth remains, or images with no verifiable origin at all. This is worth stating plainly, because the absence of physical evidence is itself part of the mystery, not proof that the story is empty, but a reminder that some ancient traditions may never leave behind the kind of evidence modern science is equipped to find. And yet the story does not end with a single culture. Traditions of divine or semi-divine beings intermarrying with humans, producing extraordinary and often destructive offspring, appear across the ancient world. In Greek myths of demigods born from gods and mortal women, in Mesopotamian tales of divine kingship, in traditions from cultures with no known contact with one another. Is this coincidence? A shared human instinct to explain strength, disaster, or the mystery of extraordinary individuals through divine parentage? Or is it the scattered memory of something once witnessed and then reshaped, generation after generation, into myth? Some researchers, working well outside mainstream academic frameworks, have proposed even more speculative readings, that the Nephilim narrative encodes a memory of genuine hybridization events, or contact with beings not of human origin, folded into religious language because it was the only vocabulary available to describe it. These theories remain unverified and largely untestable by the standards of conventional research. They are included here not as claims of fact, but because no honest survey of this mystery can ignore that such theories exist, and that they have persisted for centuries rather than fading away. What remains consistent across every version of this story is the timing. The Nephilim appear in the last days before the flood. Whatever they were, literary device, folk memory, distorted history, or something else, their story ends at the same moment the world itself is remade by water. Is that structural convenience, a narrative device to explain why the flood was necessary, or is it a clue buried in the placement of the story itself about what the flood was actually meant to erase? The text moves on, the waters rise, and the giants, whatever they were, are never mentioned again in the same way. Perhaps that silence is the most telling detail of all, a story cut short, right where the answers might have begun. In the silence of the story we just left, one detail stays with us. The door closes, but someone, somewhere, remembers what was behind it. In a collection of caves overlooking the Dead Sea, in the Judean desert, that memory resurfaced in fragments, quite literally. Among the thousands of scroll pieces discovered there in the mid-20th century, archaeologists found something unexpected. Portions of an ancient text attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, a figure mentioned only briefly in the traditional biblical record, yet somehow the subject of an entire body of literature preserved for centuries in the driest, most forgotten corners of the region. Why would a minor figure, a man given only a few lines in the primary text, inspire an entire tradition of expansive, detailed writing? That question alone should give us pause. The Book of Enoch, as it has come to be known, is not a single unified work, but a compilation of several sections, likely written by different hands over several centuries, some portions dating back to at least the 3rd century BC, based on the oldest surviving fragments. It was clearly influential in its time. Later, religious texts reference it directly. Early Christian writers quote it, and yet, when the canon of accepted scripture was formalized in most traditions, Enoch was left out, preserved fully only within the Ethiopian Orthodox biblical canon, where it remains scripture to this day, translated and copied in Ge'ez for nearly 2,000 years, while the rest of the world largely forgot it existed. What was it about this text that made it too important to destroy, yet too unsettling to canonize everywhere else? The answer may lie in what the book actually says. Where the original flood narrative gives us only a few cryptic verses about the Nephilim and their origins, Enoch expands the story into something far more elaborate. It names 200 watchers, angelic beings bound by a mutual oath on a mountain identified in the text as Hermon, a peak whose name, in the account, is tied directly to that binding oath. It gives us the names of their leaders: Semjaza, who organized the descent, and Azazel, who is said to have taught humanity how to forge weapons of war and craft ornaments of vanity, mirrors, jewelry, the painting of eyes, arts the text frames not as gifts, but as corruptions that led humanity toward violence and deceit. This is where the account moves from theology into something closer to technological origin myth. Enoch doesn't just say the Watchers sinned, it says they taught. Metalworking, astrology, the reading of signs in the stars and the moon, the properties of roots and plants, enchantments. According to the text, human civilization's darker sophistications, weaponry, vanity, occult knowledge, arrived not through gradual human discovery, but through direct instruction from beings who were never supposed to interfere at all. Is this an ancient culture's way of explaining why knowledge feels double-edged? Why the same ingenuity that builds also destroys? Or is it something else? A folk memory, however distorted, of a real transfer of knowledge from a source its recipients did not fully understand and could not fully explain. So they reached for the only framework available to them, the language of angels and divine transgression. Mainstream biblical scholarship generally situates Enoch within a broader genre of apocalyptic literature common in the centuries before and after the turn of the era. Texts that used elaborate cosmic narratives to process very human anxieties: war, corruption, the sense that the world had gone wrong and someone, somewhere, must be held responsible. Under this reading, the Watchers are symbolic. Azazel's punishment, described in the text as being bound and cast into darkness in a desert location, mirrors older Near Eastern scapegoat rituals, in which sins were symbolically transferred onto a being sent into the wilderness. But more fringe interpretations have taken the text at closer to face value, treating its descriptions of the Watchers' arrival, their physical descent to a specific mountain, and their direct instruction of specific technical skills as something closer to an historical account layered in religious language. Some point to the specificity as the strongest evidence of this. Myths, they argue, tend to stay vague. This text names a mountain. It names leaders. It lists specific subjects taught. Why would purely symbolic literature bother with that degree of procedural detail? There is no way, using the tools of conventional archaeology, to test either interpretation directly. No excavation can confirm or deny what happened, if anything, on a mountain identified only within a religious text. What we do have is the trail the book itself left behind. Copied, translated, hidden, preserved by one community while abandoned by nearly every other, surfacing again in desert caves millennia later as though it had been waiting to be found. Why did this account, more than almost any other from the period, survive so completely in one place while nearly vanishing everywhere else? What did the communities who preserved it understand that the ones who discarded it did not? The scrolls answer some of our questions, but in doing so, they raise a deeper one, not about what the Watchers did, but about why their story refused to disappear. We left the story of the Watchers with a question about survival, why one account endured while others faded. But buried inside that same account is a smaller, sharper mystery, one that concerns a single name: Azazel. Not a location this time, not an object, but a figure whose punishment, as described in the text, is oddly, deliberately specific. Bound hand and foot, thrown into darkness, and covered with sharp rocks in a desert place, left to await judgment. Why such precise staging for a being some interpretations treat as purely symbolic? A metaphor rarely needs a burial procedure. To understand why Azazel's treatment stands apart, it helps to return to what the text says he actually did. Among the 200 Watchers named in the account, most are described only in passing, their individual contributions blurred together. Azazel is different. He is singled out again and again as the one who taught humanity the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the tools of organized violence, and, in the same breath, the working of metals into ornament. Bracelets, decorations, the art of coloring the eyebrows, the use of precious stones and dyes. It is a strange pairing. Weapons of war and instruments of vanity, credited to the same source in the same short passage. Why would an ancient author link these two things together? One explanation, favored by scholars working within the framework of ancient Near Eastern literature, is that the pairing reflects a broader theme found throughout apocalyptic writing of the period. That human downfall comes not from a single vice, but from the seduction of appearance alongside the escalation of violence. That vanity and warfare are, in this worldview, two branches of the same corrupted tree. Civilization's outward sophistication, in other words, is framed as inseparable from its capacity for destruction. But there's a more unsettling question sitting just beneath that explanation. If this passage were purely symbolic, why does it read so much like a technical inventory? The text doesn't simply say Azazel brought war and vanity into the world in the abstract. It lists specific crafts, specific materials, specific processes, the kind of granular detail you would expect from an account trying to explain how something was actually done, not merely that it was wrong. Ancient metallurgy, especially ironworking, is itself a genuine turning point in human history, one that archaeologists can trace through slag deposits, tools, and forges across the ancient world, bronze into iron, ornament into weapon. Was this text, intentionally or not, encoding a real technological shift into the language of forbidden teaching? Or is that connection simply our modern instinct to look for hidden history in every ancient story, whether it's there or not? Then there is the punishment itself, which resists easy symbolism precisely because of how procedural it is. Azazel is not simply cursed, he is bound. He is thrown into a specific kind of darkness, in a specific kind of place, and covered over, awaiting a future day of judgment when he will be cast into fire. Some scholars have connected this scene to a ritual described elsewhere in ancient tradition. A scapegoat, laden symbolically with the sins of a community, sent out into the wilderness to a place associated with that same name, Azazel, never to return. If that connection holds, then the Book of Enoch may be doing something quite deliberate, taking an existing ritual concept already tied to the removal of communal guilt and building an entire mythic biography around it, explaining why such a ritual existed in the first place. That reading brings Azazel back into the realm of the symbolic, a figure invented, or at least expanded, to justify a practice whose true origins had already been forgotten by the time this text was written. It's a satisfying explanation in its way. Rituals often accumulate stories after the fact, myths built backward to explain traditions whose original purpose has been lost. And yet, the more fringe interpretations of this passage push in a different direction entirely, treating Azazel not as a ritual figure or a moral lesson, but as a representative of a broader, more literal claim within the text. That specific knowledge, specific technology, arrived in human hands through instruction rather than discovery, and that this particular figure was remembered across centuries and communities as the one most responsible for the darker half of that exchange. These interpretations remain outside mainstream scholarship, unverifiable by the standards used to test conventional historical claims. They are worth noting not because they resolve anything, but because the specificity of the original text keeps inviting them back, generation after generation, refusing to let the story rest as pure metaphor. What we're left with, ultimately, is a name attached to an unusually detailed punishment, connected to an unusually detailed list of forbidden crafts, inside a text that survived by the narrowest of margins. Was Azazel a scapegoat given a backstory? A folk memory of a real transition in human technology, wrapped in the only language available to explain it? Or something the text's original audience understood completely, and we, reading it thousands of years later, can only partially reconstruct? The rocks covering him, according to the account, remain until Judgment Day. The text never tells us what lies beneath them. Perhaps that silence is the point. A mystery deliberately left sealed, waiting, like the ground itself, for someone to finally look underneath. If the rocks over Azazel keep their secret, another set of stones, half a world away in geography but strangely close in spirit, has already begun to give a little of theirs up. On a windswept hilltop in southeastern Turkey, beneath what archaeologists initially assumed was nothing more than a medieval cemetery, lies a complex of massive carved limestone pillars, arranged in careful circles, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing upward of 10 tons. This is Göbekli Tepe, and when radiocarbon dating placed its oldest layers at roughly 9600 BC, it did something few archaeological sites have ever done. It rewrote the assumed timeline of civilization itself. Before this discovery, the standard model of human development was fairly linear. Agriculture came first, the story went, producing surplus food and settled populations, and only then, once humans had the stability and organization that farming allowed, did they build monumental structures and organized religion. Göbekli Tepe inverted that sequence entirely. Here was a massive, coordinated construction project, requiring hundreds of workers, sophisticated stone carving techniques, and communal planning, built, according to the evidence, by hunter-gatherers before agriculture is believed to have existed in the region at all. Why would people with no permanent settlements, no domesticated crops, no draft animals, undertake something on this scale? That single verified fact, a monument older than farming, is enough on its own to unsettle a tidy narrative. But it's what's carved into the pillars that deepens the puzzle. Many of the T-shaped stones bear intricate relief carvings: foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and abstract symbols whose meaning remains entirely undeciphered. Some pillars appear to represent stylized human or humanoid forms, with arms carved along their sides, hands meeting at the center, as though the stone itself has been shaped into a standing figure. What were these figures meant to represent? Ancestors? Deities? Something else? A way of encoding memory or belief that we simply no longer have the key to translate. Mainstream archaeology treats Göbekli Tepe as evidence that the human capacity for complex symbolic thought, cooperation, and religious practice predates agriculture rather than following from it. That ritual and shared belief may have been the very thing that pulled scattered hunter-gatherer groups together into cooperative labor in the first place, rather than farming creating the conditions for religion afterward. Under this reading, the site is not evidence of a lost civilization in the dramatic sense, but proof that our ancestors were more organized, more capable, and more spiritually sophisticated at an earlier date than previously assumed. And yet, deliberately or not, the site has become a magnet for a very different kind of explanation. Some researchers working outside conventional academic frameworks point to the site's age, its abrupt appearance in the archaeological record, its equally abrupt abandonment and burial. The entire complex appears to have been deliberately buried under tons of packed earth and rubble for reasons still unexplained, and ask whether Göbekli Tepe represents not the beginning of monumental construction, but a late remnant of something older still. A structure raised, they suggest, by a civilization already in possession of advanced techniques of stoneworking and social organization, whose earlier history has simply not survived, either lost to time or erased by catastrophe. This idea remains speculative and lacks the kind of physical evidence that would allow it to be tested by conventional methods. But the questions that support it are worth asking honestly. Why does something this advanced appear with so little visible precedent? Where are the intermediate stages, the smaller and simpler structures that would typically show a skill developing gradually over centuries? The burial of the site adds another layer entirely. Structures like this are rarely buried deliberately, unless the people who built them wanted them hidden, protected, or ended. Was it a ritual closing? A symbolic act marking the end of an era or belief system? Was it a practical decision, sealing away a place considered too powerful or too dangerous to leave exposed? Whatever the reason, the choice preserved the site remarkably well, protecting its carvings from thousands of years of erosion that might otherwise have erased them completely. In a strange way, the very act that hid Göbekli Tepe from human eyes may be the reason it survived long enough for those eyes to eventually find it again. This chapter of the mystery connects back to a question we've circled throughout this exploration. How much of the ancient world's true sophistication has simply not survived to be measured? Wood, textiles, unfired mud brick, anything organic, all of it decays, burns, erodes, disappears within a few thousand years under most conditions. Stone endures. But stone is only ever a fraction of what any culture builds and knows. If a monument this complex could remain completely unknown to modern archaeology until 1994, hidden beneath what looked like an unremarkable hill, what else might still be waiting beneath the surface, in places no one has yet thought to dig? Göbekli Tepe answered one question definitively, that civilization's roots reach further back than we assumed. But in doing so, it opened a far larger one. If we were wrong about the timeline once, so completely and so recently, what else about the world before? Recorded history remains buried, unexamined, simply because we never thought to look. Buried monuments raise one kind of question: what was built and why? But scattered throughout the ancient world's oldest writings is a different kind of puzzle entirely. Not structures, but bodies. Kings and warriors remembered not for what they built, but for how large they were said to have been. In the region of Bashan, east of the Jordan River, ancient texts describe a king named Og, ruler of a kingdom whose capital, according to the same tradition, contained an iron bed measuring some 13 feet in length. The bed itself, the text notes almost as an aside, was still on display in a city called Rabbah at the time of writing. A strange detail, oddly archival for a text often treated as pure legend. Why include something so specific, so seemingly verifiable unless the author expected someone might go and check? OG is not the only figure of his kind. Ancient Near Eastern texts are threaded with references to peoples described as unusually large. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, tribal or dynastic groups whose names appear alongside descriptions of great height and strength, often in the context of territories conquered or displaced by later populations. Some of these names appear designed less as ethnic labels than as a kind of shorthand for those who came before, the previous occupants of a land, remembered as larger than life in both a literal and a figurative sense. Is that simply how oral memory works? Magnifying the stature of predecessors the way memory magnifies almost everything with distance and time? Or were these traditions preserving something closer to observed fact, however exaggerated in the retelling? This pattern is not confined to one region or one textual tradition. Greek mythology remembers the Titans and the Gigantes, primordial beings of enormous size who ruled or warred before the age of recognizable human history, eventually overthrown or subdued by a newer generation of gods. Norse tradition preserves the Jotnar, giants present at the very beginning of the world, older than the gods themselves, locked in an uneasy, often hostile relationship with them. Traditions from cultures across the Americas, from the Pacific Islands, and from parts of Asia contain remarkably similar figures. Earlier, larger beings, present before the current order of the world, often responsible for shaping the landscape itself before fading from prominence or being defeated outright. Why does this particular pattern, smaller, later humans succeeding a race of giants, recur with such consistency across cultures that had no plausible means of contact with one another? Mainstream anthropology tends to treat this as a near-universal feature of oral tradition. Societies frequently remember their predecessors or explain unusual natural features through figures of exaggerated scale. A massive boulder, an unusually large ancient foundation stone, an oversized fossil bone unearthed by chance and with no framework to identify it correctly. Any of these could, over generations of storytelling, calcify into the memory of an actual giant who once lived there. Under this reading, giants are less a historical population and more a recurring solution to a recurring problem. How do you explain the outsized, the ancient, the inexplicable, using only the vocabulary available to you? But the specificity of some accounts complicates that tidy explanation. Augi's bed is measured, its resting place is named. The text treats it as a checkable fact, not a poetic flourish. Excavations at sites associated with the Rephaim and related peoples have, in some cases, uncovered unusually large architectural elements, oversized door thresholds, massive foundation stones set at a scale that exceeds typical construction of the period, though whether this reflects the size of the people who built them, or simply a building tradition that favored monumental scale for its own sake, remains genuinely unresolved. Larger stones do not require larger builders, and yet the coincidence of giant peoples and unusually large architecture appearing in the same textual and archaeological record is difficult to dismiss entirely as coincidence. Fringe researchers have gone considerably further, citing 19th and early 20th century newspaper reports of oversized skeletal remains uncovered in mounds and burial sites around the world. Accounts that, when traced back to their sources, are almost never accompanied by surviving physical evidence, verifiable measurements, or specimens available for modern examination. Most can be explained by misidentified animal bones, exaggerated journalism common to the era, or outright fabrication. That pattern of unverifiable claims should be stated plainly, and yet it sits uneasily alongside genuine, well-documented textual traditions across unconnected cultures that insist, independently of one another, that an earlier and larger people preceded the current one. Was this an ancient world's way of processing its own sense of smallness against the ruins of an older, grander past it no longer fully understood? A shorthand for peoples defeated, displaced, and mythologized in the process? Or is there something underneath these stories, however distorted by centuries of retelling, that once had a literal basis, now lost beneath layers of legend so thick they may never be fully peeled back? The bed in Rabbah is gone now, lost to time along with the city that once displayed it. But the question it left behind has outlived it by thousands of years. If it was real, who was it built for? And what happened to them? If Og's bed was a relic of the giants above the ground, our next thread leads somewhere far darker, beneath it. Ancient tradition doesn't just tell us the Watchers descended, taught, and were judged. It tells us where their punishment was carried out. And that location, according to more than one ancient source, was not on the Earth's surface at all, but beneath it, in a place of confinement so remote from the world of the living that even later writers struggled to describe it in ordinary geographic terms. The Book of Enoch places the Watchers' judgment in stages. First bound at the mountain of their original descent, they are later said to be led to a desolate place, a valley of burning fire, or in other passages, an abyss containing pillars of fire reaching upward and downward beyond sight, where they will remain until a final day of judgment. The language shifts between passages, sometimes describing a place on the Earth's surface, sometimes something closer to a void beneath it entirely, as though the text itself is struggling to locate something its author understood only in fragments, translated imperfectly into the geography of the world he actually knew. This idea did not stay contained within one tradition. A letter attributed to the Apostle Peter, written centuries after Enoch but clearly drawing from the same well of tradition, references disobedient angels being cast into a place of restraint, held in chains of deepest darkness, reserved for judgment. The word used in the original Greek for this place is striking. Tartarus, a term borrowed directly from Greek cosmology, where it denotes not simply the underworld of the dead, but a prison beneath even that. A place so remote that, according to Hesiod's account written centuries earlier, an anvil dropped from the surface of the earth would fall for 9 full days before reaching it, and a second anvil dropped from that depth would fall for 9 more days before reaching the bottom. Why would 2 entirely separate traditions, one rooted in ancient Near Eastern angelology, the other in Greek cosmological myth, arrive at strikingly similar architecture? A prison not merely distant but layered beneath the underworld itself, reserved specifically for beings who defied a cosmic order predating humanity. Is this simply how ancient minds, working independently, tended to imagine ultimate punishment as a kind of maximum distance from the world of the living? Or does the overlap suggest something these cultures were drawing from a shared, older source now lost to us, a common inheritance of cosmological ideas passed between civilizations that otherwise had little direct contact? Mainstream biblical and classical scholarship generally favors the former explanation. Ancient peoples across the Mediterranean and the Near East frequently borrowed and adapted cosmological concepts from their neighbors through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, and the underlying logic of the worst beings are held furthest from the world of the living is not a difficult idea for separate cultures to arrive at independently. Under this reading, Tartarus and Enoch's abyss are best understood as parallel developments of a common ancient anxiety, that some transgressions are too severe to be resolved by ordinary death, requiring instead an eternal, spatially remote confinement, safely separated from the world those beings once endangered. But the specificity with which these locations are described continues to invite closer scrutiny. These aren't vague gestures toward somewhere far away. They involve careful, almost measured language, chains, pillars of fire, layers of darkness, falling objects measured in days. Why would purely symbolic literature bother constructing such an elaborate, almost architectural cosmology, when a simpler image of eternal punishment would have served the same moral purpose? More speculative interpretations have leaned into this specificity, treating these descriptions not as invented cosmology, but as distorted memory of something else entirely, perhaps deep geological features genuinely encountered and mythologized by early observers with no framework to describe them scientifically, or, in the more fringe corners of this discussion, as encoded references to a genuine, undiscovered structure beneath the Earth's surface, sealed away by forces the ancient authors understood only through religious language. These readings remain firmly outside verified scholarship and offer no physical evidence that could be independently tested. They persist, nonetheless, because the texts themselves keep returning to the same unusual level of detail, refusing to settle into pure metaphor no matter how many times conventional explanations are offered. What's left, after weighing both readings, is a strange kind of consistency. Multiple ancient cultures, writing centuries apart, independently converging on the idea that some transgressions demand not death, not exile, but burial beneath the world itself, a punishment defined by depth, distance, and darkness rather than fire alone. Whether that consistency reflects a shared psychological instinct, a shared cultural inheritance, or a shared memory of something else now impossible to verify, no one has definitively resolved. The Watchers, according to every version of this story, remain there still, bound, waiting, unseen. The texts tell us they are held until a final judgment yet to come. They do not tell us what, if anything, still stirs beneath the layers of darkness in the meantime, and that silence, perhaps more than anything else in this account, is the part the ancient authors chose not to explain. From darkness beneath the earth, we return, finally, to water, because if anything could unbind the Watchers from their prison, tradition tells us, it was the flood still waiting on the horizon of this story. And that flood, when it came, is said to have erased something else entirely, the rivers that once marked the boundaries of paradise itself. The description is precise, almost surveyor-like in its detail. A single river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides into 4 branches. 2 of these, the Tigris and the Euphrates, are named plainly, and they still flow today, largely along courses geologists believe have shifted only modestly over millennia. The other 2, the Pishon and the Gihon, are described with equal confidence. The text tells us exactly where they run. The Pishon winds through a land rich in gold, bdellium resin, and onyx stone. The Gihon flows around an entire region. And then, having named them with such specificity, history simply stops mentioning them. No later text confidently locates them. No inscription references crossing them. They vanish from the record as completely as if they had been erased on purpose. Why would an ancient author invent 2 rivers with this degree of geographic specificity, complete with named resources and named lands, only for both to disappear without a trace? Myths, generally, don't bother with that kind of specificity unless they're describing something the audience could, in principle, verify. This is not vague poetic language about a land flowing with abundance. It is closer to an itinerary. For centuries, the leading explanation was straightforward. Exaggeration, symbolic elaboration layered onto 2 real, still existing rivers to make the garden's boundaries feel suitably vast and prosperous. Under this view, the Pishon and Gihon were never meant to be found, because they were never fully real to begin with. Literary flourishes meant to frame the Tigris and Euphrates within a larger, more mythic geography. But in recent decades, that explanation has been complicated by satellite imagery and geological surveying that few of the text's earliest interpreters could have imagined. Radar imaging conducted in the 1990s revealed the traces of an ancient, long-buried river system running beneath what is now the Arabian Desert. A channel scientists have come to call the Kuwait River, a fossil waterway that appears to have once carried substantial flow from the Arabian interior toward the Persian Gulf, before drying up and vanishing beneath wind-blown sand thousands of years ago. Could this be the Pishon? Its ancient course preserved not in living memory, but in sediment and radar returns, waiting quietly under the desert for modern instruments capable of finding it. The question grows more intriguing still when we consider the Persian Gulf itself. Geological and archaeological evidence increasingly supports the idea that, at the height of the last glacial period, when global sea levels sat dramatically lower than they do now, the floor of what is today the Gulf was dry land, a vast, fertile basin fed by the combined outflow of the Tigris, the Euphrates, and additional rivers draining from the Arabian Peninsula. As the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, beginning roughly 8,000 years ago and continuing over several millennia, this entire basin was gradually submerged, its river channels drowned beneath advancing seawater. If Eden's geography was ever a real physical landscape, this flooded basin fits the description with unsettling precision. 4 rivers converging in a single fertile lowland, later erased not by myth, but by measurable, datable sea level rise. Is it coincidence that a text describing rivers no one can find today aligns so closely with a landscape we now know was drowned by real, scientifically documented flooding? Or does this connection suggest something more provocative? That the flood story sitting at the center of this entire exploration and the Eden story that precedes it may both be distorted cultural memories of the same prehistoric event, rising seas that swallowed a fertile, once inhabited basin, remembered generations later not as gradual submersion, but as a single, catastrophic, world-ending deluge. Mainstream researchers remain cautious about drawing too direct a line between geology and scripture, noting that flood myths appear independently in cultures with no connection to the Persian Gulf at all, and that sea level rise, while dramatic, unfolded over centuries rather than a single cataclysmic event. That caution is worth respecting. And yet the alignment between a disappearing river system and a mythic geography built entirely around rivers that no longer exist remains, at minimum, a remarkable coincidence, one that neither confirms nor fully dismisses the possibility that Eden's map was once an actual map. What we're left with is a landscape hiding in plain sight, not above the ground, where Göbekli Tepe waited under an unremarkable hill, but beneath sand and beneath the sea, in channels only modern radar and sonar have been able to trace. If the Pishon and Gihon were real, they are down there still, buried under thousands of years of shifting desert and rising water. The question that remains is whether anyone will ever excavate far enough or dive deep enough to know for certain what they've found, or whether some rivers, like some mysteries, are simply meant to stay lost. Rivers can be buried, and mountains can be carved and covered. But before either of those, there was something quieter, and arguably far harder to erase entirely: sound, words. The very first language humans used to name the rivers, the mountains, and each other. And according to more than one ancient tradition, that original language was not simply one dialect among many, it was, in some sense, the only one. A single, shared human tongue, spoken by everyone, everywhere, before something happened to shatter it. The most famous account of this shattering comes from a story set generations after the flood: humanity, still speaking one language, migrating together and beginning construction of a great city and tower, only to have that single language deliberately confused, scattering people across the earth in fragmented, mutually unintelligible groups. But look closely at the text, and a curious detail emerges. This story assumes, almost as background fact, that a single universal language was simply the default condition of the post-flood world. It doesn't argue for this idea. It doesn't explain how such a thing came to be. It treats it as something the audience would have already understood, which raises a quiet but important question. If the confusion of languages was considered remarkable enough to require its own story, what does that imply about the language that existed before it? Was that original, unified tongue assumed to stretch back even further to the pre-flood world this entire exploration has been circling? Historical linguistics offers a scientific counterpart to this idea, though a considerably more modest one. Comparative linguists have long worked to reconstruct hypothetical ancestor languages by analyzing shared patterns across related language families. Proto-Indo-European, for instance, a theoretical common ancestor of languages as far-flung as Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, and English, reconstructed entirely through systematic comparison, since no written record of it survives. This method has genuine scientific standing, but even its most ambitious practitioners generally stop well short of proposing a single ancestor for all human language everywhere. The deeper you push back in time, the more the evidence thins, until, at a certain point, comparative linguistics simply runs out of reconstructible material. Is that limitation a sign that no single original language ever existed to find? Or is it simply a reflection of how much time erases, regardless of what once was? Here, the ancient world offers something unexpected, an actual myth about the origin of linguistic diversity, embedded not in the more famous Tower narrative, but in an older Mesopotamian text, describing a mythic past in which all people, it says, once spoke to a certain god in a single tongue, until that same deity, in an act attributed to rivalry among the gods, altered speech itself, introducing confusion where there had been none. This account predates the more familiar Tower narrative by centuries, based on the age of the tablets on which it survives. Its existence tells us something important. The idea of an original, unified human language, later shattered by design rather than gradual drift, was not confined to one culture's imagination. It appeared independently in a separate tradition centuries earlier, describing essentially the same transformation. Why would two unconnected literary traditions, separated by significant time and originating from different theological frameworks, each preserve the idea that language diversity was not a natural, gradual development, but a sudden, deliberate imposition? Mainstream linguistic anthropology generally treats this as another example of ancient cultures constructing explanatory myths for observable phenomena they had no other framework to understand. Language diversity is, after all, a strange and disorienting fact of human experience. The realization that a neighboring people, physically similar, living not far away, can be utterly incomprehensible in speech. A sudden mythic origin for that confusion is, in this reading, simply a more satisfying explanation than the slow, unglamorous reality of linguistic drift occurring gradually over tens of thousands of years of human migration and isolation. But more speculative voices have pointed to something else: the peculiar consistency, across many of the world's oldest mythological traditions, of stories describing not a gradual drift into different languages, but a specific, singular event, of relatively recent standing in cosmic terms, that deliberately fractured a previously unified form of communication. If language truly diverged only through slow, undirected processes over tens of thousands of years, why do so many distinct cultures instead remember something abrupt? A single moment, a single cause, an act rather than a drift. Is this merely a shared narrative convenience, humanity's tendency to compress long processes into single dramatic events for the sake of memorable storytelling? Or could it hint at something else, some genuine disruption, geographic or catastrophic, that scattered early human populations abruptly enough to leave a lasting impression of suddenness in cultural memory, even if the underlying linguistic drift that followed was, in fact, gradual? No fragment of that original, unified language has ever been recovered, if it ever existed at all. No tablet, no inscription, claims to preserve it directly. What remains are only the stories describing its loss, echoes of an echo, told in languages that, according to the very traditions preserving them, were never meant to exist in the first place. If there was once a single voice humanity shared before everything divided, the deepest mystery may not be what it sounded like, but why, across so many unconnected corners of the ancient world, its disappearance was thought worth remembering at all. If a language could be lost in an instant, shattered by design rather than drift, then perhaps it isn't so strange that someone, somewhere in this story, tried to make sure something else survived the coming catastrophe. Not people alone, not animals alone, but knowledge itself, committed to some form durable enough to outlast the flood. According to a persistent thread running through several ancient and extra-biblical traditions, that is precisely what Noah is said to have done, not merely building a vessel to save flesh and blood, but preserving, in written form, the accumulated knowledge of the world about to be erased. The most detailed version of this claim doesn't come from the primary flood narrative itself, which says nothing at all about books or writing. It comes from later traditions, expansions, and retellings composed well after the original account, in texts such as the Book of Jubilees, a work that survives complete only in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, much like Enoch before it. Jubilees describes Noah not simply as a builder and a survivor, but as an inheritor, a recipient of written knowledge passed down from his ancestors, including, in some tellings, texts attributed to Enoch himself, describing astronomical calculations, calendrical systems, and moral instruction. According to this account, Noah is said to have safeguarded these writings, later passing them to his sons, who carried fragments of this inherited knowledge forward into the post-flood world. Why would later tradition feel compelled to add this detail, when the earliest and most authoritative account is entirely silent on it? One explanation is simply narrative necessity. If the flood was meant to erase a corrupted world, later writers may have wrestled with an uncomfortable follow-up question. How, then, did humanity still seem to possess so much specific knowledge afterward? Astronomical observation, agricultural technique, methods of measuring time. A total erasure of civilization, followed by a rapid reappearance of sophisticated knowledge among Noah's descendants, creates a gap that these later texts may have been written specifically to fill. Under this reading, the idea of preserved books is less a historical claim and more a literary patch, smoothing over a logical inconsistency the original story left unaddressed. But other ancient traditions approach the same idea from an entirely different angle, and with considerably more specificity. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century, references an older claim, traced back even further to accounts attributed to the Babylonian priest-historian Berossus, describing how the descendants of the earliest humans, anticipating a coming destruction by either flood or fire, inscribed their discoveries in astronomy and other sciences onto 2 pillars, one built of brick, in case fire destroyed the world, and one built of stone, in case flood took its place. Josephus claims one of these pillars, the stone one, still survived and could be seen in the region of Syria in his own lifetime. This claim deserves to be treated carefully, precisely because of how specific it is. Josephus was not writing pure legend for its own sake. He was a historian attempting, however imperfectly by modern standards, to document what he understood as verifiable claims about the ancient past, including a location where his readers could, in theory, go look for themselves. Did such a pillar genuinely exist in some form during his lifetime, later lost to war, erosion, or simple neglect over the intervening 2,000 years? Or was Josephus repeating an already old legend, treating a symbolic or invented tradition as though it were verified fact, the way historians of every era sometimes do when working from sources they trust more than they should? There is no pillar standing today that any archaeologist has confidently identified with this account. No modern excavation has produced stone tablets bearing pre-flood astronomical data. And yet the persistence of this specific claim across multiple independent sources spanning centuries gives it a different texture than a simple invented flourish. Berossus, writing from within a Babylonian priestly tradition with access to genuinely ancient Mesopotamian records, and Josephus, writing centuries later from an entirely different cultural and religious vantage point, both preserve strikingly similar accounts. Why would 2 writers, operating in different eras and drawing on different source material, converge so precisely on the same idea: knowledge deliberately inscribed in stone, specifically to survive a catastrophic flood? Mainstream historians generally treat this convergence as evidence of a shared, older Mesopotamian tradition, one predating both Berossus and the biblical flood account. Concerning antediluvian sages who were credited with founding the arts and sciences before a great deluge, a tradition genuinely reflected in Sumerian king lists and wisdom literature describing 7 legendary sages active before the flood. Under this reading, the preserved books motif is a literary descendant of much older Mesopotamian ideas about ancient wisdom, rather than a literal historical event involving Noah specifically. Still, the underlying instinct behind all these accounts, across cultures, across centuries, remains consistent and, in its way, deeply human. The fear that catastrophe might erase not just people, but everything people have ever learned, and the corresponding hope that some fragment, inscribed carefully enough, in a durable enough material, might survive long after everything else is gone. Did such a fragment ever actually endure? Was it lost to time along with the world it described? Or is it still out there, in some unremarkable stretch of land, mistaken for nothing more than an old and weathered stone? If Noah's pillars were built to survive a catastrophe, one man, according to the oldest genealogical record in the tradition, seems to have vanished before any catastrophe touched him at all. His name appears in a short, strange line, easy to miss if you aren't reading carefully. A man who lived, walked, and then simply was not, because the text says he was taken. The genealogy that records this is otherwise almost mechanical in its rhythm. Name after name, each one living a certain number of years, fathering children, living more years, and dying. It is a formula, repeated with only minor variation, generation after generation. And then it breaks. Enoch's entry follows the same structure for a moment, his age at the birth of his son, the years that follow. But where every other name in the list ends with the same closing phrase, "and he died," Enoch's does not. Instead, the text says only that he walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. Why would a genealogical record, otherwise so rigidly formulaic, deviate at exactly one point, for exactly one figure? A scribal error seems unlikely, given how precisely the surrounding structure is maintained on either side. If this was a deliberate choice by whoever assembled the text, it raises an immediate question. What did the original audience understand this deviation to mean? Was this a euphemism for an ordinary death, phrased delicately for a particularly righteous man? Or was it meant quite literally as an account of someone who left the world of the living without dying in the conventional sense at all? Later tradition overwhelmingly favors the second reading and expands on it considerably. The Book of Jubilees describes Enoch not simply vanishing, but being taken from among humanity specifically to record the deeds of every generation, functioning afterward as a kind of witness, situated in a location the text associates with the Garden of Eden itself, present but somehow set apart from ordinary human life. The Book of Enoch goes even further, framing much of its content as a direct account of what Enoch witnessed during extended journeys through the heavens, guided by angelic figures, before his removal from the earthly world became final. In these expanded traditions, Enoch is transformed from a background genealogical name into one of the most significant figures in the entire pre-flood narrative, a human being who crossed some boundary ordinarily reserved for divine or angelic beings, and who returned, at least long enough to record what he had seen, before crossing that boundary one final time. This raises an obvious question for anyone examining the tradition with a careful eye. Why would such a comparatively minor figure, described only briefly and without embellishment in the earliest surviving record, become the subject of such extensive, detailed expansion in later centuries? Individuals of far greater narrative importance elsewhere in the tradition receive nowhere near this degree of supplementary attention. What was it about Enoch's particular disappearance that seemed to invite, almost demand, further explanation? One answer, favored by mainstream biblical scholarship, treats this expansion as a natural response to ambiguity. Sacred silence, especially surrounding a genuinely unusual textual anomaly, tends to attract elaboration over time, particularly in periods when apocalyptic literature was flourishing and audiences were hungry for detailed accounts of the heavens, angelic hierarchies, and cosmic judgment. Enoch's brief, unexplained departure from the world offered later writers an ideal, pre-existing framework onto which they could attach increasingly elaborate visionary material that reflected the theological and cosmological concerns of their own later era, rather than any genuine information about the pre-flood world itself. But other traditions, further from the mainstream, have approached Enoch's disappearance from an entirely different angle, treating it not as a later literary expansion, but as a distorted memory of something else. An account, however transformed by centuries of retelling, of a genuine transition experienced by a real historical or legendary figure, one whose fate was remembered as fundamentally different from ordinary death. Because, in some sense understood by the earliest tradition, it genuinely was different. Comparative mythologists have noted, cautiously, that Enoch's account bears a structural resemblance to other ancient traditions, describing exceptional individuals who cross into a different mode of existence without conventional death. Figures such as Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood survivor granted immortality and relocated to a distant divine dwelling place, or various culture heroes across unrelated traditions said to have been taken up rather than allowed to die in the ordinary way. Is this simply a recurring narrative device, humanity's way of honoring its most exceptional figures by imagining an ending grander than death? Or does the recurrence of this specific pattern, across cultures with no clear connection, suggest something these traditions were independently trying to describe, using whatever narrative tools were available to them? What makes Enoch's case distinct from many of these parallel accounts is the sheer volume of material later attributed directly to him, an entire body of literature, claiming to record precisely what he witnessed during his time away from ordinary human life, preserved carefully enough by at least one community to survive intact for 2 millennia while vanishing almost everywhere else. If this material was pure invention, composed centuries after Enoch supposedly lived, why does it maintain such internal consistency across its various sections, describing coherent cosmological structures, calendrical systems, and angelic hierarchies that later apocalyptic literature would continue to draw upon for generations? And if it was not pure invention, what precisely was it drawing from? No physical evidence exists, and none could reasonably be expected to exist, confirming or denying what happened to Enoch. This is a mystery that resists the tools of archaeology entirely, existing solely within textual tradition, genealogical anomaly, and centuries of careful, dedicated preservation by communities who considered this account too significant to let disappear, even as the wider world moved on and largely forgot it. What remains is the anomaly itself. One name, breaking one pattern, in one otherwise unremarkable list of ancestors, and the enormous, unresolved question that a single break has left behind. Did Enoch die, quietly, in a way the text simply chose not to describe plainly? Or did something happen to him that the earliest tradition understood clearly, but that we, reading the fragments left behind thousands of years later, can only glimpse at the very edges of a story that never fully explains itself? The same list that broke its pattern for Enoch keeps another kind of record throughout its length, one so unusual that it's easy to read past it without pausing. until you actually stop and do the arithmetic. Adam, the text says, lived 930 years, Seth 912, Jared 962, Methuselah, the longest lived of them all, 969 years, a number so specific it reads less like round mythic exaggeration and more like an actual accounting. However implausible the total may seem by any modern measure of human biology, these are not vague claims of long ago or many years. They are precise, itemized, cross-referenced against each other throughout the genealogy, allowing later readers to calculate, with reasonable confidence, exactly how many years separated Adam's creation from the flood itself, and exactly how many of these patriarchs would have been alive simultaneously at any given point in that span. The specificity itself is part of the puzzle. Why would a text constructing pure allegory bother with numbers this exact, consistent enough to support detailed chronological calculation across 10 full generations? This pattern, it turns out, is not unique to one tradition. Sumerian king lists, inscribed on tablets predating the biblical genealogies by centuries, describe a series of rulers who governed before a great flood, with reigns recorded in numbers that dwarf even the patriarchal lifespans, some kings credited with tens of thousands of years on the throne. After the flood, according to these same lists, reign lengths drop dramatically, settling into figures far closer to plausible human lifespans. The pattern is strikingly similar to the biblical genealogy, where lifespans too decline sharply in the generations following the deluge, tapering from patriarchs living close to a millennium down to lifespans much closer to those recorded in later, more historically verifiable periods. Why would two entirely separate textual traditions, from different regions and religious frameworks, both preserve this same essential structure? Extraordinarily long pre-flood lifespans, followed by a sudden, sustained decline afterward? Mainstream biblical scholarship offers several explanations, none mutually exclusive. Some point to numerical systems used by ancient Mesopotamian cultures, particularly a base 60 counting system that may have influenced how later scribes, working from older source material, translated units of time. Under certain proposed conversions, a lifespan recorded in an ancient text using one counting convention could be dramatically inflated if reinterpreted using a different one centuries later, as the same numbers passed between cultures and numerical systems over the course of transmission and translation. If this theory holds, the patriarchs' extraordinary ages might reflect not a genuine claim of near-millennial human lifespans, but a mathematical artifact, a translation error compounding across centuries of copying and reinterpretation, ultimately producing numbers no single scribe ever intended as a literal claim about human biology. Other scholars favor a more symbolic reading entirely, noting that many of the specific numbers recorded for the patriarchs carry mathematical significance within ancient Near Eastern numerology, figures divisible by culturally significant numbers, or constructed to align with other symbolic patterns embedded elsewhere in the text. Under this reading, the numbers were never meant to be taken as literal biological ages at all, but as a kind of symbolic architecture, encoding theological or cosmological meaning through careful numerical construction, a genre of ancient writing considerably more comfortable with meaningful numbers than modern readers, accustomed to strictly literal accounting, tend to assume. And yet, both of these explanations, however reasonable, leave a lingering discomfort for careful readers. If the numbers are pure translation artifacts or purely symbolic constructions, why does the genealogy maintain such careful internal consistency, generation after generation, allowing for exact chronological calculation across the entire pre-flood period? Symbolic numbers, generally, do not need to interlock this precisely with each other to convey their meaning. And translation artifacts, however plausible in isolated cases, would need to have compounded with remarkable, almost improbable consistency across 10 separate genealogical entries to produce a chronology this internally coherent. This is where more speculative interpretations enter the discussion, and it's worth stating plainly that these remain outside verified scholarship, resting on no confirmed physical or biological evidence. Some researchers, working from outside conventional academic frameworks, have proposed that the pre-flood world described in these traditions may have differed from our own, in ways that made extended human lifespans genuinely possible. Differences in atmospheric composition, radiation exposure, or environmental conditions that some have speculated could have existed before a catastrophic global event permanently altered the planet's protective systems. These theories are almost entirely unfalsifiable using current scientific methods, resting on no direct physical evidence from the period they describe, and mainstream science offers no confirmed mechanism by which such dramatic lifespan extension could have occurred in early humans. They persist nonetheless, not because they've been demonstrated, but because the specific, internally consistent, sharply declining pattern recorded across multiple ancient sources continues to resist easy dismissal as pure invention or simple scribal accident. There is a third possibility, quieter than either extreme, that some scholars have raised with considerably more caution: that these numbers reflect genuine, ancient oral traditions concerning the earliest human generations, traditions that had already grown uncertain about precise chronology by the time they were finally committed to writing, centuries or millennia after the events they claimed to describe. Under this reading, the numbers may represent an honest, if imprecise, ancient attempt to reconstruct an already distant past, using whatever fragmentary information remained available, rather than either translation error or a deliberate theological construction. This explanation accounts for the numbers' rough internal consistency without requiring either extraordinary biology or perfectly executed literary symbolism, though it, too, remains ultimately unprovable given the total absence of independent physical evidence from the period in question. What remains consistent across every explanation offered is the pattern itself. Extraordinary claimed lifespans before the flood, a sharp and sustained decline afterward, preserved independently across multiple ancient cultures with limited direct contact. Whether that pattern reflects numerical convention, symbolic architecture, distorted memory, or something entirely outside our current understanding of ancient human life, remains genuinely unresolved. The numbers sit in the text exactly as they were recorded thousands of years ago, precise, consistent, and quietly resistant to any single explanation that fully satisfies every detail. Perhaps that resistance is itself the most honest answer available, a mystery preserved not despite its specificity, but because of it. Numbers that resist explanation are one kind of anomaly. A single line of genealogy, naming a craft rather than a lifespan, is another kind entirely. And it belongs to a man mentioned only once, in a single verse, credited with an achievement that archaeology insists shouldn't have been possible yet. His name is Tubal-Cain, and the text describes him simply as an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. That's the entire account. No narrative, no detail about how he came to this knowledge, no description of the tools he built, no mention of where this metalworking supposedly took place. Just a name, a lineage, and a single, remarkably specific claim. This man taught the working of two distinct metals, one of which, according to the conventional archaeological timeline, humanity would not master for many centuries after the world this genealogy claims to describe. That timeline is worth stating plainly, because it's where the mystery actually begins. The archaeological record is fairly consistent on this point. Bronze working, requiring the alloying of copper with tin or arsenic, develops gradually across the ancient Near East beginning sometime in the 4th millennium BC, itself requiring centuries of accumulated metallurgical knowledge before reliable, replicable bronze production became widespread. Iron working follows much later still. True iron smelting, distinct from the occasional use of meteoric iron, which required no smelting at all, only appears reliably in the archaeological record around 1200 BC, coinciding with what historians call the Bronze Age collapse, when established trade networks broke down, and cultures across the region were forced to adapt to scarcer bronze supplies by developing iron-working techniques instead. Iron, in other words, arrives late, and arrives specifically as a response to Bronze Age scarcity, not as a parallel or simultaneous discovery alongside it. So, why does this genealogy, describing a period the text itself situates before the flood, credit a single individual with mastering both metals at once, centuries or millennia before the archaeological record shows either technology existing, let alone existing together? Is this simply an anachronism, a detail added or preserved by later scribes who, writing well after both metals were common knowledge, simply assumed their audience's familiar technologies must have existed since the beginning of human history? Ancient texts frequently do this, projecting the material culture of the writer's own era backward onto a much earlier, only partially remembered past. Under this reading, Tubal-Cain's dual mastery reflects nothing more than the assumptions of whoever eventually wrote the account down, centuries after any genuine pre-flood period, rather than a real claim about actual prehistoric technology. That explanation is straightforward and widely accepted within mainstream biblical scholarship, but it doesn't fully account for a stranger detail sitting nearby in the same short genealogical passage. Tubal-Cain's family, as described in this brief section, reads almost like a catalog of foundational human specializations, introduced all at once within a single generation. His half-brother Jabal is credited as the first to live in tents and keep livestock, the origin, in other words, of pastoral herding as a distinct way of life. Another brother, Jubal, is credited as the father of all who play the lyre and pipe, the origin of instrumental music. And then Tubal-Cain, metalworking. 3 foundational technologies or ways of life, 3 brothers, 1 family, 1 generation. Why would this genealogy cluster its most significant technological claims so tightly, rather than spreading them out gradually across the many intervening generations the text otherwise describes? One answer, again favored by mainstream scholarship, treats this cluster as a literary device, a genealogical convention common in ancient Near Eastern literature, in which foundational cultural achievements are attributed to specific, sometimes symbolic ancestors, less as historical claims, and more as a way of organizing cultural memory into a comprehensible structure. Grouping herding, music, and metalworking within a single family may reflect an ancient storytelling convention, condensing what was likely a long and gradual accumulation of separate skills into a tidy, memorable narrative package, attributing each innovation to a nameable individual rather than to the slow, anonymous collective process by which such skills likely actually developed. But this explanation, reasonable as it is, still leaves an open question worth sitting with. If this genealogy is simply a symbolic organizing device, why metallurgy specifically, and why paired so precisely with iron, a technology whose real historical arrival is tied so closely to a very particular kind of crisis, the breakdown of existing bronze trade networks? Could this detail instead preserve something closer to a garbled memory of iron's actual, later arrival, folded backward into a genealogy that was otherwise concerned with a much earlier period? The way oral traditions sometimes compress separate historical eras into a single, simplified narrative timeline? More speculative voices, working outside conventional textual scholarship, have taken this anomaly further still, pointing to a small number of archaeological finds, isolated iron artifacts recovered from sites that predate the conventional Iron Age by centuries. Most explained by mainstream archaeology as rare, small-scale use of meteoric iron, a naturally occurring alloy that required no smelting knowledge at all, and was prized more as a precious material than as a practical technology. These isolated finds do not, by current scientific consensus, indicate any broader pre-Iron Age smelting capability. But their existence is occasionally cited by fringe researchers as evidence that some limited, perhaps localized knowledge of ironworking may have existed earlier and more sporadically than the dominant archaeological narrative generally allows, later lost, forgotten, and rediscovered independently centuries afterward. This remains a minority position, without broad scientific support, and it does not resolve the deeper question of the genealogy's timeline. What remains, after all these possible explanations, is a single sentence, sitting quietly within an ancient genealogy, crediting one man with two technologies that history insists should never have coexisted this early, inside a family cluster crediting two of his brothers with two other foundational human innovations, all compressed into a single generation, long before the flood the surrounding text insists was still to come. Was this simply how ancient memory organized itself, gathering scattered innovations under a handful of memorable names? Or does a single, oddly specific verse, easy to read past without a second thought, preserve some genuine fragment of a technological history considerably older and considerably stranger than the timeline we've settled on believing? A family that could forge iron and pluck strings from a lyre needed somewhere to live, and according to the same brief cluster of early genealogy, that need was answered generations earlier by the very first man ever said to build a city. Not a village, not a settlement of tents. A city named, according to the text, after his own son. And the man who built it is the last person we might expect to found the earliest urban center in human history. Cain, remembered elsewhere in the same tradition primarily as a wanderer, marked and exiled, condemned to restlessness after the killing of his brother. The text is almost jarringly brief about it. After his exile, Cain settles in a region called Nod, east of Eden, has a son named Enoch, and then, in a single clause easy to miss amid the surrounding genealogy, builds a city, naming it after that son. No description of its size, its construction, its population, or its purpose. Just the bare claim itself, dropped into the narrative and then left entirely unexplored as the text moves on to list further descendants. Why include this detail at all if the author had no intention of developing it further? A wandering exile, marked specifically as someone who would never again successfully work the ground, somehow settles down long enough to found not just a home, but an entire city, an achievement that, by any reasonable definition, requires organized labor, accumulated resources, and a settled population large enough to justify the effort. Where did that population come from? The text, read narrowly, describes at this point in the story only a small handful of named individuals: Adam, Eve, their children. A city implies considerably more people than a single family, yet the surrounding narrative gives us no clear account of where an urban-scale population at this early point might have originated. Mainstream biblical scholarship generally treats this as evidence that the genealogy should not be read as a strictly literal, chronological account of Earth's earliest and only human population. Under this reading, the text likely reflects and compresses a much longer and more gradual period of human population growth and settlement than its brief narrative structure suggests, with the city itself perhaps representing something more modest than the term implies to modern readers. A small fortified settlement, or an early administrative center rather than a sprawling metropolis in the modern sense. This interpretation fits comfortably within the broader archaeological understanding of how early urbanization actually developed, gradually over centuries, as agricultural surplus allowed populations to concentrate, specialize, and eventually organize into recognizable proto-urban centers, the earliest solid archaeological examples of which, sites like Jericho and Çatalhöyük, both considerably predate the more famous later cities of the Mesopotamian Bronze Age. This is where the story connects to something concrete and verifiable. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements yet excavated, shows evidence of organized, walled habitation dating back roughly to 9000 BC, remarkably early in the broader arc of human civilization, and considerably earlier than the sophisticated Bronze Age cities most people associate with the ancient world. Çatalhöyük, in central Turkey, presents an equally striking case. A densely packed settlement of mud brick homes, entered through rooftop openings rather than ground-level doors, occupied continuously for well over 1,000 years, beginning around 7100 BC. Its walls decorated with elaborate paintings and its floors, in some homes, containing the buried remains of ancestors, suggesting a settled, complex social and even spiritual life considerably earlier than conventional timelines once assumed possible. Do these genuinely ancient settlements offer a plausible real-world anchor for the otherwise unexplained claim of Cain City, or is this simply another case of an intriguing coincidence in which any sufficiently ancient urban discovery inevitably invites comparison to any sufficiently ancient textual reference, regardless of whether the two were ever meant to describe the same thing? The text names Cain City after his son Enoch, notably the same name later attached to the more famous book-writing figure several generations further down the same genealogy, a repetition that itself raises questions about whether these accounts, compiled from multiple older oral traditions, may have conflated separate figures or events over centuries of retelling before being fixed into their final written form. More speculative interpretations lean further into this ambiguity, suggesting that Cain's City may preserve a distorted memory of the very earliest phase of organized human settlement itself, the transition point at which small family groups first began coalescing into larger cooperative communities, a genuinely significant and poorly documented moment in human prehistory, here compressed by oral tradition into a single, named individual's singular achievement, the way founding myths across many cultures tend to credit one legendary figure with an achievement that, historically, likely emerged gradually through the efforts of many. Under this reading, Cain himself may function less as a specific historical builder and more as a symbolic marker, representing an entire era of human transition condensed into a single genealogical entry. And yet, a smaller number of researchers, working well outside mainstream frameworks, have pushed the question further still, asking whether the placement of this city within a narrative explicitly describing a period before a catastrophic global flood might imply something more provocative. That organized urban settlement, rather than emerging gradually over the millennia following the flood as conventional history suggests, may have already existed, in at least some limited or localized form, considerably earlier than currently accepted archaeological timelines allow, evidence for which, if it existed, might simply not have survived the very catastrophe this entire exploration keeps circling back to. This remains firmly speculative, without confirmed archaeological support, and stands in tension with the well-documented, gradual timeline that sites like Jericho and Çatalhöyük themselves represent. What we're left with, ultimately, is one clause in an ancient genealogy, describing a city built by an exile, populated by people the surrounding text never accounts for, named after a son whose name reappears, confusingly, several generations later. Was this an early scribal compression of a longer, forgotten history of gradual settlement? A symbolic marker for humanity's first step toward civilization, attributed to a single, memorable name? Or a genuine, if brief, memory of something built and lost long before the flood the rest of this story keeps moving steadily toward? A city whose walls, if they ever stood at all, have never been found, and may simply be waiting, still. Beneath ground, no one has yet thought carefully enough to search. If Cain's city may lie buried beneath ground, no one has searched carefully. The flood that ultimately followed it left a different kind of trace. Not in one location, but in nearly every culture on Earth. And that, more than almost any other thread in this exploration, is where the mystery becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss. Consider the sheer geographic spread. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets preserve the account of Utnapishtim, warned by a god to build a massive vessel, load it with his family and the seed of every living creature, and survive a flood sent to destroy a corrupted humanity. In ancient Greece, the story of Deucalion describes much the same structure. A righteous man, warned in advance, who builds a chest or ark, survives a flood meant to wipe out a wicked age, and afterward repopulates the earth. Thousands of miles away, entirely unconnected by any known trade route or cultural contact at the time these traditions likely formed, Hindu tradition preserves the story of Manu, warned by a fish, later revealed as a divine being, to build a boat and survive a flood that destroys the world, afterward performing a sacrifice from which humanity is renewed. And the pattern doesn't stop at Eurasia. Among the Hopi and other indigenous peoples of the Americas, oral traditions describe a great flood survived by a small number of people who escaped by climbing to higher ground or sealing themselves inside hollowed reeds or vessels, afterward emerging to repopulate a transformed world. In China, ancient tradition remembers Gun and his son Yu, tasked across 2 generations with controlling catastrophic floodwaters that threatened to destroy the land entirely, eventually succeeding through careful management of the waters rather than survival alone. Aboriginal Australian traditions, among the oldest continuously maintained oral histories on Earth, include flood narratives tied to ancestral beings and landscape-altering deluges passed down across many thousands of years. Why does this particular story, a catastrophic, world-altering flood, survived by a small warned group, followed by a renewal or repopulation of the Earth, appear with such consistency across cultures that by every conventional measure of ancient history had no meaningful contact with one another? This is the question that sits at the very center of comparative flood mythology, and it has never been fully resolved, despite more than a century of serious scholarly attention. The most widely accepted explanation treats this consistency as a product of shared human experience rather than shared origin. Catastrophic flooding, after all, is not a rare event in human history. Rivers overflow. Coastal regions flood. Glacial lakes burst their boundaries with sudden, devastating force. Nearly every ancient civilization settled near water specifically because water sustained agriculture and trade, which means nearly every ancient civilization also lived with the genuine, recurring risk of catastrophic flooding. Under this reading, flood myths are less a single shared memory and more a predictable, independent response to a universal human vulnerability. A scenario likely to generate similar mythological structures wherever it occurred, simply because the fundamental narrative, devastating water, A small group of survivors, a warning or divine intervention, eventual renewal, offers a natural way for cultures anywhere to process the trauma and randomness of catastrophic loss. There is genuine geological evidence supporting localized catastrophic flooding events significant enough to leave lasting cultural impressions. In Mesopotamia specifically, archaeological excavations at sites including Ur and Shuruppak have uncovered substantial layers of water-deposited silt, in some cases several feet thick, interrupting the continuous archaeological record at a level corresponding to a period of significant local flooding. This physical evidence lends real weight to the idea that at least some flood traditions, particularly those from Mesopotamia, may be rooted in an actual, severe, regionally significant flooding event, even if it fell considerably short of a truly global catastrophe. But the independent invention theory, however statistically reasonable, has never fully satisfied every researcher examining this pattern closely, and it's worth understanding why. It isn't simply that flood stories exist broadly across cultures. Localized flooding is common enough that this alone wouldn't be surprising. What draws continued attention is the recurrence of specific structural details across otherwise unconnected traditions. Advance warning delivered through a dream, a divine visitor, or a natural sign. The specific instruction to build a vessel of a particular, sometimes carefully described design. The deliberate preservation of animals alongside human survivors. And, in several traditions, the eventual release of a bird to determine whether floodwaters had receded, a detail appearing with striking similarity in both the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts, despite representing entirely separate textual traditions. Are these narrative coincidences the kind of detail any sufficiently developed survival story might naturally include? Or does their specific, repeated co-occurrence suggest something closer to shared transmission, ideas passed between ancient trade networks and travelers over centuries, gradually blending into locally adapted versions of what may have originated as a single cultural story? Beyond the mainstream and the moderately skeptical, a further category of researchers, working from geological and even astronomical data, has proposed a considerably more provocative possibility: that a genuine, global or near-global climatic event, tied to the rapid melting of Ice Age glaciers and the resulting well-documented rise in sea levels beginning roughly 11,000 years ago, may have produced flooding severe and widespread enough to leave an impression on human populations across multiple, disconnected regions simultaneously, each culture independently mythologizing what was, in fact, a shared, if not singular, environmental catastrophe unfolding at broadly the same period in prehistory. This theory remains actively debated, difficult to test with precision, and unable to fully explain why such a gradual, multi-century process would be remembered almost universally as a single sudden event rather than a slow environmental shift. What remains, after weighing every explanation available, is the pattern itself, persistent, global, and structurally consistent in ways that continue to resist any single, fully satisfying resolution. Was this humanity's shared, independent response to a universal vulnerability? A story passed hand to hand across ancient trade routes, reshaped by each culture that received it? Or the scattered, imperfect memory of something that actually happened, on a scale large enough to leave its mark on nearly every corner of the ancient world? The waters, whatever their true origin, have receded everywhere except from the stories themselves. Stories that, after thousands of years and across every inhabited continent, still refuse to stop being told. A story told on every continent is one kind of mystery. But tucked inside several of those same traditions is a smaller, quieter detail, easy to overlook amid the drama of rising water and desperate survival: the names of places, kingdoms, cities, ruling dynasties, listed with specific names and specific durations, said to have existed before the flood came, and, in the words of the record itself, swept over everything. One clay tablet, inscribed in ancient Sumer, and known today as the Sumerian King List, preserves exactly this kind of record. And it is worth looking at closely, because it does something almost no other flood account attempts. It gives us bureaucracy before it gives us catastrophe. The list opens not with myth, but with administration. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven and was first established in the city of Eridu. It then proceeds, city by city, king by king, recording precise reign lengths for each ruler, in a tone closer to a royal archive than a legend. And the reign lengths recorded for this earliest pre-flood period are staggering. One king is credited with a reign of tens of thousands of years. Across the handful of cities and rulers listed before the flood, the combined total reaches well over 200,000 years of recorded kingship, an impossible figure by any conventional measure of human lifespan, yet presented within the same document, using the same administrative format, as reign lengths that become entirely plausible immediately after the flood is mentioned. Why would a document capable of precise, believable record-keeping in its later sections open with numbers this extreme in its earlier ones? This is where the list becomes genuinely strange, because it doesn't simply mention the flood in passing. It marks it as a hard boundary, stating plainly that after the flood had swept over the land, kingship again descended from heaven, and was re-established at a different city entirely, with reign lengths that immediately return to something resembling ordinary human scale. The document itself, in other words, appears to be drawing a deliberate line between two distinct categories of history: an extraordinary, almost mythic period before the flood, and a more grounded, administratively plausible period after it. Was this ancient scribal culture consciously marking the flood as the boundary between legend and record, myth and history? And if so, what does that imply about how seriously the cities and kings listed before that boundary were meant to be taken? Mainstream Assyriologists generally treat the pre-flood section of the list as a blend of genuine ancient city names: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak are all real, extensively excavated Mesopotamian sites, with archaeological layers confirming settlements stretching back many centuries before the historical periods most clearly documented in the archaeological record, combined with wildly exaggerated reign lengths, likely constructed using the same base 60 numerical system that complicates so many other ancient chronological claims. Under this reading, the cities themselves are historically real, genuinely ancient, and correctly remembered as some of the earliest urban centers in Mesopotamia. What's exaggerated in this interpretation isn't the existence of these places, but the individual reign lengths attributed to their earliest, most legendary rulers, likely inflated for reasons connected to numerology, later political legitimization strategies, or simple centuries of oral transmission before the list was finally inscribed in its surviving written form. That explanation accounts for a great deal, but it leaves one detail somewhat harder to dismiss: the archaeological layers themselves. At Shuruppak specifically, one of the 5 cities named in the pre-flood section of the list, and notably, in some versions of the Mesopotamian flood tradition, identified as the hometown of the flood survivor himself, excavations have revealed a substantial, clearly defined layer of water-deposited silt and sediment, sitting directly atop remains from an earlier settlement phase and beneath a later phase of renewed, continuous habitation. This is not a minor or ambiguous layer. It represents a significant disruptive flooding event severe enough to interrupt continuous occupation at a real, verifiably ancient city, one of the very cities named specifically by name, in a king list that treats the flood as the dividing line of its entire chronological structure. Is this coincidence or convergence? A real city, independently confirmed through excavation to have experienced a genuine, significant flood event, appears by name in an ancient list that positions the flood as history's defining boundary. Does this mean the entire pre-flood section of the list, cities, kings, and all, deserves to be read with more historical seriousness than exaggerated reign lengths alone might suggest? Or is this simply a case of an ancient scribal tradition correctly remembering real cities and a real regional flood, while still exaggerating or mythologizing the specific rulers and reign lengths associated with them, blending genuine historical memory with an entirely separate layer of numerological or theological embellishment? The question grows more complicated still when we widen the lens beyond Mesopotamia. Plato, writing in ancient Greece many centuries after these Sumerian records were first inscribed, describes an entirely different kind of pre-flood kingdom. Atlantis, an advanced, powerful island civilization, organized with remarkable administrative and military sophistication, ultimately destroyed and submerged following a catastrophic natural disaster, described in his account as occurring some 9,000 years before his own time. Plato's account is, by his own framing, presented as a history transmitted through Egyptian priestly records, relayed to a Greek visitor generations before Plato's own writing. Mainstream classical scholarship generally treats Atlantis as Plato's own philosophical invention, constructed to illustrate ideas about hubris, political corruption, and the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations, rather than as a genuine historical account of a real lost kingdom. And yet, the structural parallel to the Sumerian material is difficult to ignore entirely. An advanced, organized, named kingdom, existing before a catastrophic flood, destroyed and lost as a direct result of that catastrophe, remembered afterward only through a chain of transmitted second-hand record-keeping. Is this simply because flood narratives, wherever they appear, naturally tend to generate this same lost golden age structure, regardless of whether any genuine historical kingdom stands behind them? Or did Plato, whether he fully realized it or not, tap into an older, broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern tradition of pre-flood kingdoms, one that had already been circulating in various forms for many centuries before he ever put stylus to wax? More speculative researchers, working well outside conventional classical and Assyriological scholarship, have pushed this comparison further, proposing that the persistent appearance of lost kingdom narratives across multiple, otherwise unconnected ancient sources, Sumerian, Greek, and, in less rigorously documented forms, various other regional traditions describing golden ages ended by catastrophe, may point toward a shared cultural memory of a genuinely more organized, more administratively sophisticated pre-flood world than mainstream archaeology currently accepts, later erased almost entirely by whatever catastrophic event these traditions circle back to again and again. This remains firmly speculative, unsupported by confirmed physical evidence beyond the localized Mesopotamian flood layers already discussed, and it does not adequately explain why, if such kingdoms genuinely existed at meaningful scale, their physical remains have left so little additional trace beyond scattered silt layers and second-hand literary transmission. What we're left with, weighing every layer of this puzzle together, is a consistent pattern that refuses to fully resolve in either direction. Real cities, genuinely ancient and thoroughly excavated, named specifically in a record that treats a flood as history's defining boundary. A genuine, physically confirmed flood layer at a real site, matching the record's own account of catastrophe. Reign lengths and kingdom descriptions that stretch credibility far beyond ordinary historical plausibility. And an echo of the same basic structure: advanced kingdom, catastrophic flood, near total loss, surfacing again centuries later in an entirely different culture through Plato's account of Atlantis. Were these kingdoms real, administratively organized places, remembered accurately in their location and existence but exaggerated in their scale and duration? Were they later inventions, attached retroactively to genuinely ancient city names that had, by the time these lists were finally written, already faded into legend? Or do they represent something else entirely? Scattered, imperfect fragments of an era considerably more organized and considerably more lost than the archaeological record currently allows us to confirm. The silt at Shuruppak has long since settled. The kings who once ruled there, whatever they truly were, left behind only their names, and a boundary in the record marking the exact moment their world came to an end. The kings of Shuruppak counted their reigns in numbers too vast to hold, but numbers in the ancient world were rarely used for power alone. They were also used to track something far more delicate, the sky. And buried within the same layers of tradition that preserve pre-flood kingdoms and impossible lifespans is a quieter, more technical mystery. The claim that humanity, before the flood, already possessed a working calendar, a system precise enough to track the movement of sun, moon, and stars, generations before conventional history says such precision should have existed. The clearest version of this claim comes, once again, from the expanded tradition surrounding Enoch. The Book of Enoch devotes an entire lengthy section, often called the astronomical book by scholars who study it, and considered by many to be among the oldest material in the entire Enochic collection, to a detailed description of the movements of the sun and moon, the mechanics of the year, and the operation of what the text describes as heavenly gates, through which the sun rises and sets at different points throughout the year. The text describes a 364-day solar calendar, divided into 12 months, further organized into 4 seasonal quarters of 91 days each, with specific attention paid to the discrepancy this creates against the moon's own slightly different cycle. This is not vague, poetic language about the changing of seasons. It reads as a technical document, attempting to reconcile 2 different celestial cycles into a single, workable system. Why would an ancient religious text, attributed to a figure who lived, according to the same tradition, before a global flood, contain material this specific and this mathematically inclined? A calendar isn't a decorative detail. It's an operational technology requiring sustained, careful, long-term observation of the sky, along with some method of recording those observations precisely enough to notice and correct for the small but consistent misalignment between solar and lunar cycles. That kind of sustained observational tradition typically implies a settled population, freed enough from constant subsistence pressure to dedicate real attention to tracking celestial patterns over years, if not generations. Does the presence of this material inside the Enochic tradition suggest that such a population and such a tradition genuinely existed earlier than conventional archaeology currently assumes? The archaeological record does offer some genuine verified support for surprisingly early astronomical sophistication. Structures like Stonehenge in England, whose earliest phases date to around 3000 BC, show clear alignment with solstice sunrises and sunsets, indicating deliberate, careful attention to solar movement by a culture with no written language at all. Even earlier, the Nabta Playa site in the Egyptian desert contains a stone circle, dated to approximately 4800 BC, that appears deliberately aligned with the summer solstice and certain star positions, predating Stonehenge by well over 1,000 years, and demonstrating that careful astronomical observation, embedded directly into monumental construction, was occurring considerably earlier than once assumed. And Göbekli Tepe itself, already discussed earlier in this exploration, has drawn its own share of astronomical speculation, with some researchers proposing though this remains genuinely contested within mainstream archaeology, that certain carved pillars may encode references to specific constellations or celestial events. If cultures without writing were already tracking solstices and stellar alignments with this degree of precision by 4800 BC, is it truly implausible that a more developed calendrical system, of the kind described in the Enochic astronomical book, could have existed even earlier still, in a tradition whose direct written or oral transmission simply didn't survive as clearly as the stone monuments did? Or is this comparison stretching the evidence further than it should go, treating solstice-aligned architecture, which requires only basic observational tracking repeated over multiple years, as equivalent to a fully developed, mathematically reconciled 364-day calendar system, which represents a considerably more sophisticated intellectual achievement? Mainstream biblical and historical scholarship generally situates the astronomical Book of Enoch within a much later period than the pre-flood setting the broader Enochic tradition claims for it. Most scholars date the text's actual composition to sometime in the 3rd century BC, based on internal linguistic features, and its close relationship to calendrical debates known to have been active within Jewish communities during that later period, particularly disputes over whether religious festivals should be calculated using a solar calendar, like the one described in Enoch, or a lunar calendar, favored by competing religious authorities of the time. Under this reading, the pre-flood framing is a literary device lending ancient authority to what was, in reality, a contemporary argument about calendar reform, dressed in the voice of humanity's oldest legendary astronomer, to give it additional weight and legitimacy. This explanation is well supported by internal textual evidence and fits comfortably within what we know about religious calendar disputes of that later era, and yet it doesn't fully account for why the text's authors chose Enoch specifically, rather than any other legendary figure, to carry this particular authority. Nor does it fully explain why the broader tradition surrounding Enoch, across multiple independent texts and communities, consistently frames him not simply as ancient, but specifically as someone who traveled through the heavens, guided by celestial beings, and returned with direct knowledge of how the sky itself actually operates. Why attach astronomical material specifically to the one figure in the entire pre-flood genealogy already associated with crossing into a heavenly realm and returning? Some scholars, working carefully within mainstream frameworks but open to a more nuanced reading, suggest that the calendrical material in Enoch, while almost certainly composed or compiled during the later periods scholars have identified, may nonetheless preserve genuinely older Mesopotamian astronomical traditions, refracted through many centuries of transmission. Babylonian astronomers, after all, maintained meticulous celestial records stretching back well over 1,000 years before the Enochic material was likely composed, tracking lunar cycles, planetary movements, and eclipse patterns with an accuracy that would not be surpassed in some respects until many centuries later. If earlier Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge, developed across countless generations of careful sky-watching, was gradually absorbed into surrounding cultures and eventually attached, centuries later, to the legendary figure of Enoch as a way of grounding contemporary calendrical arguments in ancient authoritative memory, then the pre-flood astronomical knowledge described in the text might represent a genuine echo of real, ancient observational science, even if the specific attribution to Enoch himself and the specific pre-flood timeline remain literary rather than literal. More speculative interpretations push further still, suggesting that the unusually technical, almost procedural nature of the astronomical book, its careful attention to gates, cycles, and the reconciliation of solar and lunar discrepancies, reflects something closer to an inherited technical manual than an invented religious narrative, regardless of when it was finally set down in writing. Under this view, the text may be preserving fragments of a considerably older calendrical tradition than even the Babylonian record can confirm, one whose true origins have simply been lost beneath many centuries of retelling, reattribution, and reformation. This remains, like so much in this exploration, unverifiable by current methods, resting more on the internal character of the text than on any external physical evidence. What remains consistent across every explanation offered is the strangeness of the pairing itself. A figure remembered above nearly everyone else in the pre-flood record for crossing into the heavens and returning, becomes, centuries later, the voice chosen to carry humanity's most detailed ancient account of how the heavens actually function. Was this simply convenient literary symbolism, borrowing an ancient name to lend authority to a much later calendrical dispute? Or does the pairing suggest that whoever first attached this astronomical material to Enoch's name understood something about him, some older layer of tradition now lost to us, that made him seem like the only figure whose authority could possibly stretch far enough back to explain the sky itself? If Enoch carried the secrets of the sky, another mystery from the same era concerns something the ancient text treats with far less technical detail and far more unease: the women whose story sets the entire pre-flood catastrophe in motion, yet who are never named, never given voice, and never fully explained. The passage is brief, almost startlingly so, given what follows from it. The sons of God, it says, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took wives for themselves, choosing whomever they wanted. From this union came the Nephilim, already examined earlier in this exploration. But the women themselves, the actual human participants in this event, the mothers of beings remembered as giants and heroes of old, receive no names, no individual identity, no perspective of their own within the text. They are described only by category: daughters of men, chosen for their beauty, taken. What does this silence tell us, and what, if anything, does it conceal? This is where a careful reader has to sit with an uncomfortable structural question. Ancient genealogical texts, including the very same document containing this passage, are otherwise remarkably attentive to lineage, frequently tracing descent through specific named women where it mattered for inheritance, tribal identity, or later narrative significance. Why, then, does this particular passage, describing what the text treats as a pivotal, world-altering event, decline to name a single one of the women involved? Is this simply a reflection of how thoroughly patriarchal record-keeping in the ancient world tended to treat women as background figures, worth mentioning only in relation to male lineage and male action? Or does the anonymity itself suggest something else? That whoever recorded this account either did not have access to further detail, or deliberately chose not to preserve it? Later, expanded traditions attempt to fill this gap, though not always in ways that resolve the ambiguity. The Book of Enoch, once again, offers considerably more detail than the brief original passage, describing not just the Watchers' descent and their instruction of forbidden knowledge, but the direct consequences of these unions. Children born unusually large, consuming vast quantities of food, eventually turning to violence against humanity and against each other. Yet even here, the women themselves remain largely undeveloped as individuals. They are the mechanism through which the narrative's central catastrophe unfolds, but not, within the text's own framing, its subjects. Why does this matter for the broader mystery this exploration has been tracing? Because the identity, origin, and nature of these women sit at the exact center of one of the oldest unresolved theological and scholarly debates surrounding this entire passage. Who, or what, were the sons of God who chose them? And does the answer to that question change how we should understand the women's role in what followed? Mainstream biblical scholarship has long been divided on the nature of the sons of God themselves, and that division directly shapes how the daughters of men are understood. One prominent interpretation, sometimes called the Sethite view, holds that the sons of God were not angelic or divine beings at all, but human descendants of Seth, the righteous line established after the killing of Abel, while the daughters of men represent the line descended from Cain, already marked earlier in the text by violence and moral corruption. Under this reading, the entire passage is not describing a supernatural event at all, but a story about moral compromise through intermarriage, a warning about the dangers of the righteous line blending with a corrupted one, with sons of God functioning as a term for pious men, and beauty serving as a metaphor for worldly temptation drawing them away from righteousness. This interpretation has the advantage of avoiding supernatural claims that some later theological traditions found uncomfortable, and it aligns the passage with a recognizable, very human moral lesson about the consequences of abandoning careful boundaries between righteous and corrupted lineages. But it has never fully satisfied every scholar examining the text closely, in part because the term sons of God, as used elsewhere in the same broader textual tradition, particularly within the book of Job, consistently refers to divine or angelic beings, members of a heavenly court, rather than to human descendants of any particular lineage. If the phrase means one thing in Job and something else entirely in this passage, what justifies that shift, beyond a desire to make this specific account more theologically comfortable? The alternative interpretation, favored by the Enochic tradition and by many scholars working closely with the earliest layers of Jewish apocalyptic literature, takes the more supernatural reading at face value, that these were, in fact, angelic beings, choosing to descend and take human wives in direct violation of whatever cosmic order was meant to keep such categories separate. Under this reading, the daughters of men are not symbolic representatives of a corrupted human lineage, but genuinely ordinary human women, selected specifically because of their beauty by beings who should never have crossed that particular boundary in the first place. This interpretation restores the passage's apparent original, plain meaning, but introduces its own difficult questions. What does it mean, theologically or otherwise, for divine beings to be capable of this kind of choice and desire at all? And why does the text focus so heavily on the beings who initiated the union, while offering us almost nothing about the women who experienced its consequences most directly? This is where the mystery deepens beyond simple textual interpretation, into a question about memory and silence themselves. If this passage does preserve some genuine ancient tradition, however transformed by centuries of retelling, concerning unions between something considered divine or semi-divine and ordinary human women, why did that tradition never develop the women's perspective at all, even as it developed increasingly elaborate detail about nearly everything else surrounding the event? The watchers' names, their specific teachings, their eventual punishment, the monstrous behavior of their offspring? Every other thread of this story received centuries of expansion and elaboration. This one thread did not. Some contemporary scholars, approaching the text through the lens of gender and narrative silence rather than pure theology, have suggested that this absence is itself worth treating as data rather than mere oversight. Ancient texts, they argue, frequently preserve the perspectives of those with power to shape a tradition's transmission, while allowing other perspectives, particularly those without comparable social or religious authority, to fade from the record entirely, not through active erasure necessarily, but through simple accumulated neglect across generations of retelling by those who had little reason to preserve what they didn't consider central to the story. Under this reading, the daughters of men may represent not a minor detail overlooked by accident, but a genuine gap in the historical record, a perspective that existed, mattered, and shaped real human experience, yet simply was never considered worth writing down by those who held the pen. More speculative voices, working at the furthest edges of this discussion, have proposed that the women's silence in the text might conceal something closer to trauma than mere oversight, that whatever these unions actually involved, however we choose to interpret their supernatural or symbolic nature, the experience itself may have been remembered at least at some point in the tradition's long oral transmission, as something closer to coercion than romance, later smoothed over or simplified as the story passed through the hands of scribes more interested in explaining giants and judgment than in preserving the perspective of the women at the center of it all. This remains entirely speculative, resting on inference rather than direct textual evidence, but it's a reading that continues to resurface precisely because the silence itself is so pronounced, sitting at the heart of a story that elaborates everything except the one perspective closest to whatever actually occurred. What remains, after all this, is an absence rather than an answer. A handful of unnamed women, remembered only through the men who noticed their beauty and the beings who chose them, standing at the center of a catastrophe whose consequences reshaped, according to the tradition itself, the entire pre-flood world. Were they willing participants in a union the text simply chose not to elaborate? Victims of a story too uncomfortable for its earliest tellers to examine closely, or symbolic figures who were never meant to be understood as real individuals at all. The text never tells us their names. And in that silence, perhaps, is the truest measure of how much of this ancient world's actual experience has simply been lost, not to catastrophe, but to the quiet, ordinary process of who gets remembered and who does not. The silence surrounding the daughters of men is one kind of absence, but sitting almost directly beside it, in the very same genealogical chain, is a different kind of mystery entirely. Not a name withheld, but a name remembered so persistently, and attached to such a strange convergence of numbers that it has become, quite literally, a byword for extreme old age. His name was Methuselah, and according to the text, he lived longer than any human being ever recorded, 969 years. But it isn't merely his lifespan that makes him strange. It's the year in which that lifespan ends. Careful readers, working through the genealogy's precise, interlocking numbers, have long noticed something the text itself never states outright, but which the arithmetic makes unavoidable. Methuselah's death, calculated using the ages given for each generation between him and the flood, falls in the very same year the flood itself is said to have occurred. Not decades before, not generations removed. The same year, according to the numbers the text itself provides. Is this coincidence, the simple, unremarkable result of an already old man reaching the natural end of an unusually long life at roughly the same time as an unrelated catastrophe? Or is this precise convergence a deliberate structural signal, built into the genealogy on purpose, using Methuselah's death as a kind of narrative countdown, marking the exact moment beyond which the pre-flood world could no longer continue? This single detail carries an unusual weight, because Methuselah's name itself is remembered in later Jewish tradition as containing a kind of built-in prophecy. Some rabbinic commentators working through the etymology of his name centuries after the genealogy was written have proposed that Methuselah may be constructed from Hebrew roots suggesting something close to "when he dies it shall be sent," a name that, if this etymology holds, would mean his own father, in the act of naming him, was somehow marking his eventual death as the trigger point for the coming catastrophe. Other linguists dispute this specific reading, offering alternative etymological explanations rooted more simply in ordinary naming conventions of the period, without any embedded prophetic meaning at all. Which reading is correct remains genuinely unsettled, resting on ancient Hebrew linguistics that allow for more than one plausible interpretation. But regardless of which etymology proves correct, the numerical convergence itself remains, sitting quietly in the text for anyone patient enough to do the arithmetic. Why would a genealogy, structured with such careful, interlocking precision across 10 full generations, produce this exact alignment unless it was constructed deliberately to do so? And if it was deliberate, what was the author trying to communicate through it? That the world's most extraordinary human lifespan was granted specifically so that its natural conclusion could serve as the final, appointed signal before judgment arrived? Or is this reading, however elegant, simply the kind of pattern human minds are inclined to find in any sufficiently large and interconnected set of numbers, regardless of whether the original author intended any symbolic connection at all? This question connects to something larger than Methuselah's name alone. Throughout later Jewish and rabbinic tradition, Methuselah accumulates a reputation not merely as the oldest man who ever lived, but as a repository of accumulated pre-flood wisdom, a figure positioned, generationally, at the exact hinge point between the world before catastrophe and the world after it. He is Enoch's son, inheriting, according to several extra-biblical traditions including the Book of Jubilees, written records and teachings passed down from his father before Enoch's own mysterious departure from ordinary human life. He is also Noah's grandfather, meaning that whatever knowledge, teaching, or tradition passed through him would have had a direct, single-generation path into the one family the text tells us survived the flood itself. Structurally, within the genealogy, Methuselah occupies the most significant possible position for anyone concerned with the transmission of pre-flood knowledge into the post-flood world. Close enough to Enoch to have received whatever he preserved, and close enough to Noah to have passed it forward before everything else was lost. Is this positioning coincidental, simply an accident of ordinary genealogical spacing? Or does it suggest that later tradition, recognizing this structural placement, deliberately built up Methuselah's reputation as a wisdom keeper, specifically because his position in the family line made him the most plausible bridge for any surviving pre-flood knowledge to have taken? Mainstream scholarship tends to favor this second explanation in a modest form. Not that Methuselah was necessarily remembered accurately as an actual repository of ancient teaching, but that later writers, working centuries after the genealogy was first composed, recognized the narrative potential of his position and elaborated it accordingly, filling in a figure who receives almost no individual description in the earliest text with an entire supporting tradition constructed around the logical requirements of his place in the family line. And yet, once again, the specificity of certain later traditions complicates a purely literary explanation. Some extra-biblical sources go beyond simply describing Methuselah as a passive link in a chain of transmission, instead crediting him directly with teachings of his own, distinct from what he received from Enoch, including instruction connected to matters of judgment, repentance, and warning delivered to his own generation in the years leading up to the flood. If Methuselah were merely a structural convenience, a blank space later writers filled in for narrative completeness, why would multiple independent traditions credit him not just with receiving knowledge, but with actively teaching and warning his own contemporaries, seemingly attempting, according to some of these accounts, to persuade the world around him to change course before catastrophe arrived? And if such warnings were genuinely part of an older oral tradition, what does it mean that they apparently failed so completely that the flood came anyway, on what the numbers themselves suggest was the very year of his own death? There is something quietly haunting in this possibility, regardless of how literally or symbolically one chooses to read it. a man who outlived every other human being in recorded history, positioned at the exact junction between the last generation to possess whatever pre-flood knowledge existed and the first generation to carry a remnant of it forward, dies, according to the text's own careful arithmetic, in the same year the entire world he knew was destroyed. Whatever wisdom he held, whatever warnings he may have given, whatever knowledge passed through him from Enoch before reaching Noah, arrived at its final, irreversible deadline at precisely the moment the flood began. Was this simply a literary structure, elegantly closing one era as another opened? Or does it suggest something more unsettling? That this specific piece of the pre-flood world story understood the flood not as a sudden, unexpected catastrophe, but as an event whose timing was already, in some sense, anticipated and even named, generations in advance, through the very naming of a single child. No physical evidence exists, or could reasonably be expected to exist, to confirm any interpretation of Methuselah's name, his numerical death date, or the wisdom later tradition attributes to him. This mystery lives entirely within text, arithmetic, and centuries of careful, attentive reading by scholars and communities who noticed, and continued to notice, a pattern too precise to entirely dismiss as accident, and too symbolically loaded to entirely accept as literal historical record. What remains, after all the possible explanations are weighed against each other, is simply the convergence itself. The oldest man who ever lived, dying in the exact year everything else around him came to an end, his name perhaps carrying a warning embedded from the moment he was born, a warning the text never tells us whether anyone, including Methuselah himself, ever fully understood until it was already far too late to matter. If Methuselah's death marked one kind of ending, written invisibly into a genealogy's careful arithmetic, an earlier moment in the same broad tradition marks a different kind of beginning, one carried out not in numbers, but in smoke, blood, and the particular unexplained preference of an unseen witness. Two brothers, each bringing an offering, one accepted, one rejected, and no explanation anywhere in the text for why. The account is brief, as so much of this early material is. Cain, described as a worker of the ground, brings an offering of its produce. Abel, a keeper of flocks, brings an offering from the firstborn of his flock, specifically their fat portions. The text states plainly that this second offering was regarded with favor, while Cain's was not, and it is this unexplained disparity, more than the violence that follows it, that has troubled careful readers for thousands of years. Why would one offering please and the other displease, when the text gives us no stated criteria at all for what makes a sacrifice acceptable? This is where the story becomes not simply a moral lesson about jealousy and violence, but a genuine window into one of humanity's oldest and most persistent religious practices: the offering of something valued, often something living, to a power beyond ordinary human control. Sacrifice, in some form, appears to be nearly as old as organized human religious behavior itself. Archaeological evidence for ritual offering, including carefully arranged animal remains at sites intentionally set apart from ordinary refuse, stretches back many thousands of years, well into the periods anthropologists associate with the earliest developments of structured religious practice. Why does this particular behavior, giving something up, deliberately and ritually to something unseen, appear so early and so consistently across nearly every human culture archaeology and history have ever documented? Mainstream anthropological explanations generally treat sacrifice as an outgrowth of exchange logic applied to the divine. If humans understood their relationships with each other partly through the giving and receiving of gifts, extending that same logic toward forces perceived as controlling weather, harvest, health, and survival would have been a natural conceptual leap. Under this reading, sacrifice functioned as a kind of communication, a way of establishing or maintaining a relationship with forces otherwise entirely beyond human negotiation, using the only currency available, something of genuine value, given up freely in the hope of favor, protection, or simple acknowledgement. Cain and Abel's story, under this interpretation, may represent one of the earliest surviving literary examples of a much older, already established human practice, rather than an account of sacrifice's actual historical origin. But the specific detail regarding what was offered and what was seemingly preferred complicates any purely functional reading. The text notes, with unusual precision for such a brief passage, that Abel brought not simply animals, but specifically the firstborn of his flock, and specifically their fat portions, details that align closely with sacrificial practices described much later and in far greater detail elsewhere, in the same broader tradition, where fat portions and firstborn animals are repeatedly specified as particularly significant offerings. Why would this level of ritual specificity appear this early in the text, in an account otherwise so sparse on nearly every other detail? Is this evidence that later scribes, writing centuries after this story would have taken place, retroactively inserted specific ritual language from their own, much later sacrificial practices into an origin story that originally contained no such detail at all? Or does it suggest that these specific ritual conventions, firstborn animals, fat portions, were understood, even by the story's earliest tellers, as having genuinely ancient roots, stretching back to the very first recorded act of worship? Cain's offering, by contrast, receives no comparable descriptive detail. He brings, the text says simply, an offering from the fruit of the ground. No mention of first fruits specifically, no mention of any particular quality or selection process applied to what he brought. Some later interpreters, working across centuries of subsequent commentary, have proposed that this absence of detail is itself the point, that Cain's offering was rejected not because of its category, grain rather than livestock, but because of some quality of carelessness or insufficiency in how it was selected and presented, in implicit contrast to Abel's carefully specified firstborn and fat portions. Under this reading, the story isn't really about which kind of offering pleases a divine power, but about the sincerity, care, and quality brought to whatever offering is made, regardless of its specific material form. This interpretation carries real theological weight within later tradition, and it resolves the passage's central ambiguity in a way that feels morally coherent to many readers. And yet, it remains, ultimately, an inference, not something the text itself states directly. The passage never actually tells us that Cain's offering was careless, or that Abel's was accepted specifically because of its careful selection. It simply reports the outcome, without explaining the reasoning behind it, leaving readers across thousands of years to supply their own explanation for a divine preference the text itself declines to justify. This silence connects to a broader pattern worth sitting with, one that echoes several other mysteries already explored throughout this examination. Ancient religious texts, again and again, seem willing to report outcomes with confidence while remaining strikingly reticent about underlying mechanisms. We are told Enoch was taken, not precisely how or why in a way that fully satisfies every question. We are told the Watchers descended and taught forbidden knowledge, without a full explanation of what made that knowledge forbidden beyond its consequences. And here, we are told one offering was favored and another was not, without any stated criteria at all. Is this simply the nature of oral tradition, compressed over centuries into brief written accounts that assume shared cultural knowledge the modern reader no longer has access to? Or does this recurring pattern of confident outcome paired with unexplained mechanism suggest something else about how these earliest religious memories were originally transmitted and understood, perhaps that the reasoning was considered self-evident to their original audience in a way it simply is not to readers separated from that context by thousands of years. More speculative interpretations, again working outside mainstream textual scholarship, have proposed that the disparity between the brothers' offerings reflects something older and more fundamental than ritual technique. A preference, embedded deep within humanity's earliest religious instincts, for blood sacrifice over vegetable offering, specifically, possibly rooted in even more ancient practices, whose original logic has been entirely lost to the historical record, surviving only as an unexplained preference passed down through this brief and enigmatic story. This remains firmly speculative, resting on comparative pattern rather than direct textual or archaeological confirmation, and it does not fully explain why later portions of the same broader tradition explicitly permit and even prescribe grain offerings under certain specific circumstances, complicating any simple claim that vegetable offerings were considered universally inferior. What remains, after all of this, is a story that reports a judgment without ever explaining its criteria, sitting at what may be the very first recorded moment of ritual offering in the entire tradition this exploration has been tracing. Why was one offering accepted and the other refused? Was it the substance of what was given, the care taken in giving it, or something else entirely, understood clearly by whoever first told this story, but lost somewhere in the many centuries between that first telling and the version that survives today? The smoke from both offerings, whatever it once carried, rose and dispersed long ago. What lingers, unresolved after thousands of years, is only the question the text itself never answers. What, exactly, made one gift worthy and the other not? The question of what made one offering worthy and another unworthy may never be answered. But beneath the Black Sea, in layers of sediment far older than any text we've examined so far, a different kind of question has recently found something closer to a physical answer. And it suggests that the flood at the center of this entire exploration may not have been the only one. It may not even have been the first. In the late 1990s, marine geologists surveying the floor of the Black Sea made a discovery that would eventually reshape how some researchers think about ancient flood memory entirely. Sediment cores taken from the seabed revealed a clear, datable transition. A layer of freshwater mollusk shells, indicating the region had once been a freshwater lake, abruptly giving way to a layer containing saltwater species, marking a sudden and dramatic influx of seawater. Radiocarbon dating placed this transition at approximately 5600 BC, a period when global sea levels, still rising from the retreat of the last ice age, appear to have breached a natural land barrier separating the Mediterranean from what was then a smaller, isolated freshwater lake, sending a catastrophic surge of saltwater pouring into the basin and rapidly expanding it into the Black Sea we recognize today. The scale of this event, according to the researchers who first proposed it, would have been genuinely dramatic. Some estimates suggest water levels in the affected basin rose by a significant margin within a relatively short span, likely months rather than years, flooding an enormous amount of previously habitable, low-lying land, and forcing whatever populations lived along the lake's original shoreline into sudden, permanent displacement. Why does this matter for the flood traditions already examined throughout this exploration? Because the timing and geography place this event squarely within the broader region where Mesopotamian and Near Eastern flood traditions would later take root, raising an obvious question. Could a genuine memory of this specific, real, geologically confirmed event have traveled outward from displaced populations, eventually settling into the flood narratives that later cultures would refine, elaborate, and eventually commit to writing? This hypothesis, often called the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, generated significant excitement when first proposed, precisely because it offered something rare in this entire field of inquiry: a datable, physically confirmed catastrophic flooding event, occurring in roughly the right region and roughly the right general era to plausibly seed later flood mythology. Displaced populations, fleeing a genuinely overwhelming and rapid inundation of their homeland, would have carried the memory of that catastrophe with them as they resettled elsewhere, potentially explaining why flood narratives cluster so persistently around the broader Near Eastern and Mesopotamian regions specifically. But the hypothesis has not gone unchallenged, and it's worth understanding exactly where the disagreement lies. Some geologists working independently on the same body of evidence have proposed a considerably more gradual timeline for the Black Sea's transformation, suggesting the shift from freshwater lake to saltwater sea may have unfolded over centuries rather than months, driven by a slower, more sustained rise in sea level rather than one sudden, catastrophic breach. Under this competing reading, there would have been no single dramatic event dramatic enough to generate the kind of vivid, world-ending flood memory later preserved in Mesopotamian and biblical tradition. Only a slow, generational displacement, unlikely to crystallize into the same kind of singular, catastrophic narrative. Why does this distinction matter so much? Because the entire plausibility of the Black Sea hypothesis as an explanation for later flood mythology depends heavily on the event having been sudden and dramatic enough to leave a lasting, vivid impression, rather than gradual enough to be absorbed quietly into ordinary generational memory without ever crystallizing into myth. The sediment cores themselves, while confirming that a transition from freshwater to saltwater genuinely occurred, do not, on their own, definitively settle whether that transition took months or centuries, and researchers on both sides of this debate continue to interpret the same underlying geological evidence differently. This uncertainty hasn't stopped the hypothesis from generating serious, sustained scholarly attention, in part because of a further tantalizing layer of evidence. Underwater archaeological surveys of the Black Sea's continental shelf, conducted in the years following the initial sediment discoveries, have identified what appear to be submerged, ancient shoreline features consistent with human habitation, sitting at depths corresponding to the lake's original, pre-flood water level. If confirmed through further excavation, these submerged features could represent genuine physical evidence of settlements displaced by whatever version of this flooding event actually occurred, offering a rare opportunity to directly examine material remains from populations who may have lived through and later mythologized the very catastrophe currently under debate. Is this then the flood, the actual historical kernel behind the traditions examined throughout this entire exploration, finally located through modern sonar and sediment analysis rather than ancient text alone? Mainstream researchers, even those who find the Black Sea hypothesis compelling, tend to urge caution here, noting that the region's later, far more famous flood traditions, particularly the detailed Mesopotamian account of Utnapishtim, are set specifically along the Tigris and Euphrates river system, considerably south and east of the Black Sea itself, raising a genuine geographic gap that any direct connection between the two would need to bridge. Population displacement and cultural transmission across that distance and across the intervening centuries remains entirely plausible, given known patterns of ancient migration and cultural exchange, but it remains a proposed connection rather than a confirmed one. And this is where the deeper mystery of this chapter reveals itself most clearly. The Black Sea event is not the only serious candidate scientists have proposed for a genuine, ancient, catastrophic flood capable of seeding later mythology. Some researchers point instead to the flooding of the Persian Gulf basin, already examined earlier in this exploration in connection with the lost rivers of Eden, as a more geographically direct candidate, given its close proximity to the Mesopotamian traditions that describe the flood in the greatest surviving detail. Others have proposed entirely separate, localized flooding events along specific stretches of the Tigris and Euphrates themselves, evidenced by the very sediment layers already discussed at sites like Shuruppak. Is it possible that ancient flood tradition doesn't preserve the memory of one single catastrophic event at all, but rather represents a kind of composite memory, drawing on multiple real flooding events, occurring across different centuries and different regions, gradually merging together across generations of retelling into the single unified narrative that later cultures eventually committed to writing? This possibility, more than any single confirmed geological event, may be the most honest answer currently available. Rather than one flood, one location, one specific date waiting to be conclusively identified, the evidence increasingly suggests a genuinely flood-prone ancient world, in which multiple real, regionally significant catastrophes, unfolding across different centuries in different corners of the same broader Near Eastern and Mediterranean landscape, may have gradually converged in cultural memory into the singular, world-ending deluge preserved in the traditions this exploration has followed from the very beginning. What remains beneath the Black Sea, and beneath the layers of Mesopotamian silt already examined, is not a single, definitive answer, but a growing body of physical evidence confirming that catastrophic flooding, on a scale genuinely capable of displacing and traumatizing entire populations, did occur repeatedly across the ancient world, in eras stretching back considerably further than the biblical flood's own traditional dating suggests. Was the flood remembered by later generations one specific event, finally locatable through sonar and sediment core? Or was it always, from its very first telling, a composite memory of many floods, merged by centuries of retelling into the single, unified catastrophe? This entire exploration has been circling from its opening moments. The water has long since settled, in every location this chapter has examined. Whether it settled once or many times remains a question the sediment itself has not yet fully answered. Whether the water settled once or many times, one consequence remains the same across every version of this story. Whatever came before it left us remarkably little to examine directly. And that absence, more than any single artifact or text explored throughout this journey, may be the deepest mystery of all. Not a place, not a name, not a number, but a gap, a silence in the physical record precisely where the richest, strangest claims in this entire exploration insist an entire world once stood. Consider what we actually have in verified physical terms from the period these traditions describe as pre-flood. Göbekli Tepe, genuinely ancient, genuinely sophisticated, dated with confidence to around 9600 BC. Scattered evidence of early settlement at sites like Jericho and Çatalhöyük, pushing organized human habitation back further than once assumed. Sediment layers at Shuruppak and beneath the Black Sea, confirming that catastrophic flooding, at various points and in various locations, genuinely occurred. This is not nothing, but set against it weigh everything the traditions themselves claim. Cities built by named individuals, sciences and technologies transmitted through specific angelic instruction, kings ruling for tens of thousands of years, a unified human language later shattered, entire libraries of astronomical and moral knowledge inscribed onto pillars built specifically to survive catastrophe. If even a fraction of this described civilization existed at the scale the traditions suggest, why does the physical record contain so comparatively little of it? This is where the question deserves to be asked plainly, without either dismissing it or overselling it. Is the disproportion between textual claim and physical evidence itself meaningful, or is it simply what we should expect given how thoroughly time erases nearly everything a civilization produces? The case for expected erasure is genuinely strong and worth taking seriously on its own terms. The vast majority of what any ancient culture actually built and used was never made from stone. Textiles decay within decades in most climates. Wood rots, burns, or is repurposed. Unfired mud brick, the most common building material across the ancient Near East, gradually dissolves back into the earth it came from, especially in regions with seasonal rainfall, leaving behind low mounds that require careful, deliberate excavation to even recognize as former settlements at all. Writing itself, unless inscribed onto fired clay tablets or carved into stone, tends to vanish entirely, meaning that entire administrative systems, personal correspondence, and everyday records could have existed and left no trace whatsoever, simply because they were written on materials incapable of surviving even a few centuries, let alone several millennia. Given this, is it truly surprising that a civilization existing, by the tradition's own account, before a catastrophic flood, would have left behind comparatively little physical evidence, especially if much of its infrastructure was built from the same perishable materials common throughout the rest of the ancient world? Under this reading, the absence of extensive pre-flood archaeological remains isn't evidence against the tradition's claims specifically. It's simply the ordinary, expected consequence of how little survives from any sufficiently distant era, regardless of what actually happened during it. And yet, this explanation, however reasonable, runs into a genuine complication when we consider what mainstream archaeology has managed to recover from periods considerably older than the traditional dating for the flood itself. Göbekli Tepe's massive stone pillars, again, predate any proposed flood date by several thousand years, and they survived precisely because they were carved from durable limestone rather than perishable material. If a genuinely advanced pre-flood civilization, capable of the sophisticated metallurgy, astronomical calculation, and organized urban settlement the traditions describe, truly existed on any significant scale, wouldn't we expect at least some comparable, durable structures or artifacts, similar in permanence to Göbekli Tepe's pillars, to have survived somewhere within the broader region these traditions describe? Why does the stone record show us sophisticated ritual architecture built by hunter-gatherers, yet apparently nothing comparably durable from the far more technologically advanced civilization the pre-flood traditions themselves describe? This is the tension that continues to animate serious, scholarly, and popular fascination with this subject alike, and it resists easy resolution in either direction. Mainstream archaeology generally responds to this tension by pointing out that the tradition's claims about pre-flood civilization, examined closely throughout this entire exploration, likely represent a considerable blend of genuine ancient memory, later literary embellishment, numerological convention, and centuries of oral transmission and reinterpretation, meaning the apparent gap between textual claim and physical record isn't a mystery requiring exotic explanation, so much as an expected result of comparing heavily elaborated religious literature against the comparatively sparse but genuine physical evidence archaeology has actually managed to recover and confirm. More speculative researchers working at the edges of this discussion, and often without the benefit of peer-reviewed confirmation, have proposed a different possibility: that the flood itself, whatever its true scale and nature, may have been considerably more destructive to the physical infrastructure of any pre-existing civilization than conventional geological models currently account for, potentially explaining why so little durable evidence survives even in regions where we might otherwise expect it. This remains almost entirely unfalsifiable using current archaeological and geological methods, resting more on the absence of evidence than on any positive physical confirmation. And it does not adequately explain why Göbekli Tepe itself, considerably older than any proposed flood date, survived largely intact despite being subjected to whatever catastrophic conditions this hypothesis proposes. Perhaps the most honest position available, after weighing every explanation this exploration has examined, sits somewhere between these extremes. The physical record does not currently support the existence of a fully realized, technologically sophisticated pre-flood civilization on the scale the most elaborate traditions describe. But the physical record also does not, and by its very nature cannot, definitively rule out the existence of smaller, more localized centers of surprising sophistication, existing earlier than currently assumed, remembered and elaborated by later oral tradition into the grander, more unified narrative that eventually reached written form. Göbekli Tepe itself stands as proof that our assumptions about what ancient hunter-gatherers were capable of building were, at least once, dramatically wrong. Is it truly unreasonable to wonder whether similar surprises, in different forms, might still be waiting beneath ground no one has yet thought carefully enough to excavate? This exploration began with a question about rivers that no longer exist, traced through kings who ruled impossible spans of time, a language shattered by unknown design, a man who did not die in any ordinary sense, and floods whose physical traces genuinely exist beneath modern seas and ancient silt. At every turn we have found real evidence, genuinely verified by careful scientific and historical method, sitting directly alongside claims that resist any such verification entirely, refusing to separate cleanly into simple categories of fact and fiction, history and myth. Perhaps that refusal is itself the truest finding this entire exploration can offer. Not a final answer about what the pre-flood world actually was, but a demonstration of how persistently and how strangely its memory continues to resist being fully explained away, even after so many centuries spent trying. What remains buried beneath sand, beneath sediment, beneath centuries of retelling and reinterpretation is a question this exploration cannot answer, and perhaps no single exploration ever fully will. How much of what these ancient traditions describe was invention? How much was memory? And how much, if any, is still down there, waiting, in ground no one has yet thought to search?